I am the world's biggest advocate of reevaluation points. I think that everyone should have reevaluation points, both personally and organizationally, where you're going to sit down and you're going to say, okay, we have this strategy. Our whole approach rests on these assumptions. Actually, A, should we have these assumptions in the first place? And B, how well are we actually doing in achieving this thing? Maybe there's different approaches to achieving our goal in a better way that's more effective. And I think that the genius of reevaluation points is that it both ensures that you have a time when you're going to be reflecting on your approach, and it also gives you permission to set aside your concerns on a day-to-day basis. Yes. So you write down that concern in your reevaluation doc, and then you go back to regular life, and you know that you're going to have a moment where you can come back and say, wait a minute, is this actually a good idea? Because if it turns out that you were doing a suboptimal thing all along, like, that's a big problem.
Hey listeners, Luisa here. You were just listening to Sarah Eustis-Guthrie from episode 207 on why she shut down her charity and why more founders should follow her lead. When I talked to Sarah last November, loads of what she said really resonated with me. And we realized we've had tons of guests over the years who have offered just some real gems about how they got where they were, advice they think is underrated, and some of their own kind of career ups and downs. But of course, many of these insights are buried in our famously long episodes. So we thought we'd compile them and make it easier for listeners to have a single episode that puts all of this wisdom in one place. Coming up, you'll hear from Holden Karnofsky on his philosophy of just kicking ass at whatever you do. Michael Webb on how to think about career planning given the insanely rapid development of AI. Chris Olah on finding the most valuable intersections of different skills and how to send cold emails that actually work. Leah Garcés on finding common ground with unlikely allies. Spencer Greenberg on recognizing toxic people who could derail your careers and life. Plus insights from a bunch of other guests we've had over the years. And remember, you can find loads more resources on the 80,000 Hours website, including a step-by-step career planning guide. You may also want to apply for our free one-on-one advising if you're facing a tough career decision, or if you want to know how to pivot into a more impactful role, or if you could just benefit from some connections in your field. Check all of that out at 80,000hours.org.
Holden Karnofsky on just kicking ass at whatever.
Yeah, so in prepping for this interview, I went back and looked at some stuff that you'd said and written over the years about career choice. And I suppose the common thread that people have probably kind of picked up on already is the idea that you should kind of just flourish in whatever, or just like trying to kick ass in kind of whatever early on. That's right. And that's a strategy in itself. I think the tone in favor of that was even sharper, I think, 5 or 10 years ago. What have you observed that makes you believe that that's a good approach? Is it primarily based on kind of empirical experience or something else?
I mean, it's pretty hard to really have justified empirical beliefs about career choice. It's, career choice, it's not even a well-posed question, because we're like, what should people do with their career? It's like, all right, well, who? And then if I start talking to an individual, well, they have like so much information that I don't about themselves, about their networks, about their feelings, which I think, Matt, I think a job is so all-consuming that your feelings about it are going to be a major factor, and how it feels to work there every day. Not saying it's the only thing that matters. I'm not saying do what you love. I'm just saying, like, it's really important, and I don't have the information about it that I could have if I'm talking to you. So there's really no version of the career choice question that is like the same kind of question as what are AI timelines. There's no version of that question that like we can really like, pinpoint our disagreements down to Bayesian probabilities and just hash it out. It's just like we're either talking in generalizations or we're talking to specific people where they've got 80% of the information. We're trying to do some value added. More like they have 99% of the information. We're trying to do some value added. So, I mean, I don't know what my views are based on. I look around myself at people who I think are doing great things and I ask how they got there. And that's most of it. So, but I absolutely think that when you kick ass, like, the job market is really unfair, and especially the market for like high impact, effective altruist jobs is really unfair. And the people who are incredible at something are so much more in demand than the people who are merely great at it. And the people who are great are so much more in demand than the people who are good. And the people who are good are so much more in demand than the people who are okay. And so it's just a huge, really important source of variation. And so then it's like, can you know enough about what cause or path you want to be on that the variance in that, the predictable variance in that, beats the variance in how good you're going to be? And I'm like, usually not, or usually at least they're quite competitive and you need to pay a lot of attention to how good you're going to be, because there's a lot of different things you could do to help with it with the most important century, and a lot of them are hard to predict today. But a robust thing is that, like, whatever you're doing, you're going to do it so much better if you're better at it. So that's part of it. Also, people who are good at things, people who kick ass, they get all these other random benefits. So one thing that happens is people who kick ass become connected to other people who kick ass. And that's like really, really valuable. It's just like a really big deal. Like, you know, you look at these AI companies and they want boards and they want the people on their boards to be impressive. And it's like those people, a lot of those people are not AI people necessarily, or they weren't for most of their careers. They kicked ass at something. That's how they got there. And, you know, a lot of my aptitude agnostic stuff is about this too, where I'm like, let's say that you missed and you picked a skill that turned out it's never going to get you a direct work EA job, but you kicked a bunch of ass and you know a bunch of other people who kick ass. So now you have this opportunity to, you know, to affect people you know and get them to do a lot of good. And they are not the people you would know if you hadn't kicked ass. It's very hard to predict what kind of job you're going to end up in, or what kind of thing is going to work out, what kind of cause you're going to, people will switch causes during their career all the time. And so I just think it's a thing that you can do at that early career stage that is more predictive is you can ask, what aptitude can I build and become really good at? And that aptitude is going to stick with me throughout my career, no matter what cause I go into. And it's going to be something that I'm building every year, even if I switch causes, even if I switch worldviews, even if things go differently than I thought, even if this job doesn't work out, I'm building this aptitude.
What are a few of the specific aptitudes that you kind of describe as an alternative way of framing what you're trying to achieve early career?
Yeah, so there's a cluster of aptitudes called organization, running, building, and boosting. And that includes things like doing management of people and helping organizations, you know, kind of set their goals, hit their targets. It can include operations jobs. It can include business operations jobs. It can include sort of, if you stretch it a little bit, like communications jobs, a lot of things. And it's like, you know, if you come into an organization and your thing is you're kind of a project manager who keeps people on track and you're a good personnel manager, that's an aptitude you're building, and that aptitude is going to stay with you. If you're doing that at a tech company, but you're really good at it and you get better at it, and then you go later to an AI lab, you know, you're still going to be good at it. And that's going to be one of the skills that you bring to the AI lab. And that's a case where you were able to build something useful without having immediately a job in the cause you wanted to be working in that then did transfer. So that's an example of an aptitude. I talk about various research aptitudes where you try to, you know, digest hard problems. I talk about a communications aptitude where you try to communicate important ideas to big audiences. You know, I go into a bunch of different things.
Yeah. So I guess 80,000 Hours over the years has talked quite a lot about career capital, which we define very broadly as anything that puts you in a better position to get a job that has impact in the future. But it obviously includes things like skills, things like the people you know, the credibility you have, even just like having money in the bank so that you can potentially change job without having to stress too much. Is this kind of a similar concept to building career capital early career, or does it maybe have a different emphasis?
Well, I mean, if you build an aptitude, then you're building career capital. An aptitude is a kind of career capital. I think the thing that I'm emphasizing in the post is that when you're at this early stage in your career and you're looking for a helpful question to ask, you're looking for a, you know, do I want to do A, B, or C? And when A, B, and C are different causes, I think that doesn't always have very clear or reliable implications for like what that means for what kind of job you're working in and how you know if you're on track. Whereas if A, B, and C are like being a project manager, being a researcher, being a kind of communicator, then it's like, well, if I want to do this, then I should take this kind of job. I can almost certainly find some kind of job like that. And then here's how I'll know if I'm getting better at it. And then if I switch, then I'll do that kind of job. And that's all. So just like, it's a question you can ask that which aptitude, which kind of career capital, which aptitude do I want to build? And you can ask the question, you can take a guess, you can probably try out the guess, and you could probably get information on whether the guess is a good guess. And you could do all that, I think, with higher likelihood earlier in your career in a reliable way versus trying to gather information on what cause should I be in, which can be done differently, but you don't always necessarily learn a lot about that from your day-to-day work in your job.
Yeah. Yeah, just to complete the list of aptitudes that you mentioned, I think the last few ones were software engineering aptitude, like quite a transferable skill. Then there was information security, so it's like computer security, helping people keep secrets. I guess that one's beginning to approach a little bit like a job or career. And then there's academia, so that's like a broad class of roles.
Yeah, some of them are broad classes of aptitudes that have a bunch of stuff in common. Like, you know, a lot of the point of the post was to be like, how do I take my guess at what I could be great at? And how do I like start learning whether it was a good guess and start changing my mind about it, which I think is often a better framework to be learning than some of these other frameworks. And then I think another aptitude is that I just skipped over, but it's political and bureaucratic aptitude. So like, if you're in the government and you're kind of climbing through the ranks, I mean, that's a thing that you can be good at or bad at. You can learn if you're good or bad at it. And if you're good at it, you're going to be good at it. And if you change your mind about what cause you want to work on, you're still going to have those skills and they're going to help you get into whatever cause you wanted. I also talk about entrepreneur. I talk about community building aptitudes, like, trying to help people discover important ideas and form a community around them. That's a thing that you can try it out. You can see if you're good at it. If you're good at it, you're going to keep getting better at it, etc.
Yeah, one thing I particularly liked about the post is it's focused on kind of guideposts to telling if you're on track in developing a given aptitude. So whether you should kind of stick with it and double down. For example, how does one tell if one is on track in political and bureaucratic aptitudes?
Yeah, sure. So that's an example. So, I think some of these other frameworks, which I think are great, but I think you can end up kind of lost on like, how am I refining my picture of what I should be doing and where I should be? So it's like, I wanted to work in AI. I managed to get this job at an AI organization. What do I do now? What am I learning about what kind of job I should be in? The aptitudes framework is a way of saying, look, if you're succeeding at the job you're in, then you are gaining positive information about your fit for that aptitude, not necessarily for that cause. If you're failing at the job you're in, you're gaining negative information about your fit for that aptitude, not necessarily that cause or that path. And so, yeah, I mean, so you gave the example of I want to be in government, and it's like, well, yeah, if you go into government and you have some peers or some close connections, they can probably after a year, they can tell you how you're doing. They can say, hey, you're doing great. You're moving up. You're getting promoted at a good rate. People here like think you're good. Like this is a good fit for you. Or they can tell you, you're kind of stalling out and like people don't like this about you and that about you, or the system doesn't like this or that about you. And then you can start thinking to yourself, okay, maybe I want to try something else. Maybe government's not for me. So it's this kind of framework where it's not too hard to see if you're succeeding or failing. A lot of people who aren't necessarily all the way in your headspace and don't have all the same weird views you have can just tell you, are you succeeding or failing? And you can tell if you're getting promoted. And also matters if you're like enjoying yourself and if you're finding it sustainable. These are all like actual predictors of whether this is going to be something that you keep getting better at and end up really good at.
Jeff Sebo about what improv comedy can teach us about doing good in the world.
If you had to just completely change careers and somehow became totally indifferent to making the world a better place, which I think would be hard for you, what would be the most kind of self-indulgent or most enjoyable career for you to pursue instead?
I love that question. I do love my career and feel very grateful to be able to do what I do. And I will say that when I was graduating from college, I was considering this as one of 3 possible careers. The other 2 were law and TV comedy. When I was in college, I had an internship in TV comedy, and I was really close to pursuing that professionally instead of going to grad school. And then even when I went to grad school, I went to NYU where I now work. I took the opportunity to study improv comedy at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater, and then I performed improv comedy in the city for several years while I was a grad student.
I love that. Yeah, I guess a bit of a rogue question, but is there anything that improv comedy can teach us about doing good in the world?
Honestly, I think there are a lot of things that it can teach us about doing good. I was not taking those classes and performing improv specifically to learn life lessons that I could apply to my work and to my attempts at altruism. But I did learn some of those lessons. I can say one general one and then maybe a couple of specific ones. So one general lesson is that philosophy and comedy are actually a lot alike. They both force us to confront cognitive dissonance, contradictions in ideas. They might do it a little bit differently. For example, a philosopher might say, consider this thought, now consider this thought, see how they contradict, how will we resolve this contradiction? Whereas a comedian might present the contradiction in an amusing manner in a way that invites you to sit with that discomfort and to, yes, find it amusing, but then to also reflect on it. And good comedy can be a vehicle for social change in the same kind of way that good philosophy can be for that reason. And sometimes it can even be a better vehicle for social change because it operates in this more playful space that helps you to let your guard down and be a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more receptive to novel ideas or resolutions to contradictions. And so I think that can be a reminder that even though we engage in really serious topics, it helps to have a little bit of a playful mindset sometimes so that you can have that same kind of open-mindedness.
Totally. Yeah, you said there were a few specific ones. What were those?
Yeah, there are also a bunch that come from improv. I can maybe mention a couple in the interest of time. One is that, of course, a foundational principle for improv comedy is yes and. So you might enter a show or a scene with a strong idea about how you want the show or the scene to go, but then a scene partner might initiate a completely different idea, and you have to be prepared to set your idea down and enthusiastically embrace this new idea and then add to it and build this new scene with your partners. And so when you practice at improv comedy and you perform improv comedy, you really have to train yourself to not impose your will on what is happening, but rather be collaborative and open-minded, to work together with others as a team to build something together, and then to be opportunistic and to be improvisational, to keep adapting to updated circumstances. And obviously, I think that is a kind of virtue and a kind of mindset that translates really well to, for instance, building a career or attempting to do good with your life.
Cool. Any others?
Yeah, another is that it trains you to identify links between things that initially seem to have nothing to do with each other. So the way that you build an improv show is you start with scenes that have nothing to do with each other, and then you do second beats of those scenes. And then as the show comes to a close, you start to tie the scenes together, and then it all weaves together and it ends in this gratifying, unified state. And similarly, I think it can help in life or in a career to have all of these different interests, all of these different aspirations, and not necessarily impose unity or integration on them right away, to let them be what they are. And then you can gradually identify surprising and interesting connections between them over time. And if you eventually develop an area of expertise, it might exist at the intersection of all of these different random interests that you had. So allowing yourself that space for curiosity, the pursuit of seemingly unrelated things, and then discovering those connections and bringing them all together in the middle of or later on in your career, I think is a really wonderful experience and one that was reinforced for me when I studied improv. Another one is that if you want to construct a good improv scene, then in addition to listening to your teammates and saying yes and building a scene collaboratively, it helps to put the direct goal of the scene in the show out of your mind. The direct goal would be finding the game of the scene. So finding a joke that can be built out over the course of the scene and can be repeated in later scenes. But if you are thinking about that goal every time you say a line, every time you make a choice, if you were thinking, I must be funny, I must be funny, I must find the game, I must find the game, that is a recipe for not being funny and not finding the game. But if you instead trust the process and trust your practice, if you trust all of those hours of work that you put in to doing improv with your teammates, and you simply exist within the scene, you play your characters, you pay attention to the situation, you eventually will find something genuinely organically funny, and then it will actually be funny because you were pursuing the goal indirectly rather than pursuing it directly. And I think that has clear implications for how we live our lives and how we try to do good works too. For effective altruists or utilitarians, if we spend all of our time thinking, how can I do the most good possible? How can I do the most good possible? How can I maximize utility? How can I maximize utility? That is a recipe for not doing the most good possible, for not maximizing utility. You would never get out of bed in the morning because you would be calculating the long-term consequences of which sock you put on your feet first. Instead, if you cultivate virtuous character traits, if you build structures that incentivize and pull good actions out of you, if you find general social and professional roles in life through which you can do the most good, and then if you spend most of your time in everyday life simply playing those roles within those structures, expressing those character traits, then you will do much more good, much more effectively and sustainably in the long run than you would have done otherwise.
Nice. I love that.
Dean Spears on being open to randomness and serendipity.
What is a piece of advice that you wish you could give to your younger self?
My younger self didn't really know how things were going to go for me, and my present day self looks back and sees a lot of surprise. And so I think, the situations where my friends and collaborators and I have managed to sometimes accomplish something, it's often been pretty surprising and serendipitous. So I think one piece of advice is to be looking for that serendipity and sort of have openness to the randomness. And, when you have a success, don't, take it too seriously. Another piece of advice is to have the friends and collaborators who are going to be able to take advantage of that with you. If that's, I told you about meeting Nikhil randomly at a program, or Mike, my collaborator on the book about birth rates, who happened to be my cubicle mate in grad school, or just so many of the collaborators in the Rice family and all of it are people who I've met happenstantially, or we've taken advantage of something randomly together. So I think Pablo Picasso said something like, yes, inspiration strikes, but it should find you at work, or something like that. I would say, yes, inspiration and randomness happens. And when it comes, be sure that you have the friends and the teammates that you can take advantage of it with, because I know that if I didn't, I wouldn't have been able to do such useful things.
Nice. Okay. I like that.
Michael Webb on how to think about career planning given the rapid developments in AI.
So I want to talk about some concrete career advice. A lot of our listeners are interested in how the development of AI should influence their own career planning. And I guess to start, to what extent should people be taking all of this AI progress in mind when making their career plans? Is it even a given that they should be?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to start with a non-answer that hopefully is still actually interesting, which is they should totally be taking AI into account they should be using it to help them with career planning. I was thinking about careers as a, 20-year-old. It's like, you have no idea what these jobs actually involve. You can read the websites in the company, and these days you can read the wonderful career profiles on the 8000 House website, but you still often have no idea what's actually involved in many of these things, right? And so if you're lucky, maybe you know someone who's done the job, but often you don't. And now you can literally go on Claude, whatever, and say, hey, please pretend you are a McKinsey consultant. Do you love your job? Please be honest. I just did this. And the answer was, I have mixed feelings about my job as a McKinsey consultant. It gives you a long list of pros and cons, right?
Oh, that's really funny.
Right. And so you can do this for all kinds of stuff. The thing I was always remember when I was, at that point of choosing first careers, I was like, what do you actually do all day? You can give me all this amazing, exciting stuff around the impact and the great colleagues and whatever, but what are you actually doing, and what's the division of your time? And these language models actually often know the answers quite well. Although they certainly are much better than whatever your first guess is. And so they can help you with that. They can help you brainstorm who to reach out to. They can help you prepare, questions to ask someone that you're having a sort of coffee informational chat with. You can tell them what you're interested in, and it will suggest careers for you. You can tell it, you are my career coach. Please figure out what questions to ask me to help me decide what to do, right? All these things.
Nice.
It can just do an amazingly good job out of the box. And then, in terms of beyond that sort of process piece, in terms of okay, how will it actually affect the choices you make, the fact the world is changing in this way. So I think both it will massively influence the economy and sort of what one should think about doing, but at the same time 90% of people are not going to be thinking very hard about it as they make their sort of career plans. So it's not you're going to be completely disadvantaging yourself by not thinking about it.
You're going to be totally left behind.
Yeah, it's more just if you think about it, then you're instantly in the top 10% of people thinking about these things.
Okay.
And so I think a few sort of concrete thoughts. I think the easiest sort of generic piece of advice is you should think really hard about how AI is going to be useful and impact the particular things that you care about and might want to work in. I think there's going to be, there's a shortage of AI researchers directly right now, and certainly alignment researchers, but people who are any old other thing, so people in government, or people working for, I don't know, all the kinds of, career profiles that you'd like to write about, know about people know about those, and they know about AI in some real detail, like you are instantly going to have a very rare and valuable skill set. And so learning about AI sort of as it is for its own sake, and then thinking really hard and carefully about how it interacts with the kinds of work that you're doing, but sort of really specializing it to your particular industry, like thinking in great detail about particular tasks, and thinking about sort of how whole production processes could be reimagined. And so thinking about those in great detail and like being really thoughtful about the risks in any particular application area, as well as sort of the more general and scary ones. I think that's just going to be, you're going to be so unique and rare and valuable that you're going to have an instant massive leg up. So that's a sort of one generic piece of advice. The other generic piece of advice as well is you can also, I think, now upskill much more quickly for any particular question or career path, right? So you're like, what does a consultant need to know? What does a grant evaluator need to know? What does a safety researcher need to know? Like all those specific things, you can actually use GPT-4 or etc. to teach yourself, or to give you a huge leg up in that sort of self, autodidactic exercise, teaching yourself, than you could before.
Okay, great. Good advice. What jobs would be sensible to go into now because demand for them is going to go up?
So I kind of think of career paths more than like specific jobs. Specific
jobs, sure. Yeah. And I think that is, what I mean.
But yeah, and these things will kind of, evolve a lot over the next, coming years for all the reasons we've been talking about. One theme that's come up a lot, I guess, in this conversation is entering a highly regulated industry you're going to be more safe and, not exposed to radical changes than entering one that is not regulated. And so if you ask for a sort of nice, steady, stable thing, go after the sort of the strong unions and the / professional bodies, like the, American Medical Association, because you'll probably have a sort of relatively easier time of things. If, however, you're someone who wants to lean into risk, which I probably, many people should, and much more than they in fact do, certainly when you're young, go for the areas where there's kind of the most change and the most likelihood of AI actually having a sort of short, more sort of near-term impact. So those are kind of like industry level thoughts. In terms of like specific what you're doing day to day, like occupation or sort of skills. So I think, first a sort of generic thought. So one is like, you want to be adding value on top of large language models. So pretend that doctors are not regulated. Okay, so imagine that like we can just change things for everyone. It's a pure market system. In that case, what I think I expect to see is very quickly GPT, Claude, whatever, starts, or fancy startup that just raised lots of money, I forget what it's called, that's like just going to build a health LLM. I'm talking with lots of these companies now, right? They can just like do a much better job than the doctors of diagnosis and prescription and all kinds of other stuff. Particularly the kind of the GP sort of more entry level stuff that requires like wide body of knowledge and everything's changing all the time and you don't have much time with people and whatever, right? And not that much physical stuff either. And so, okay, in that world, like what does a human do on top? Well, probably in that world, but certainly for the sort of the GPs of this world, again, in the pretend world where it's not regulated, so this is not going to happen, I claim, but supposing it did, you would say probably that, you know what, we don't need GPs to have anywhere near as much training as they currently are required to have, because the algorithm can do a much better job of diagnosing and prescribing. And now what their job is doing is really much more about the empathy. And it's much more, the small number of things which are more sort of physical, sort of I had to smell you or something, until we have smell GPT. I'm sure it's coming, but for now, humans have to do that. And, and sort of, they're sort of making you feel, appreciated and loved and cared for and all those kinds of things. Now, the thing is, right, is that sadly, or, I guess in a sense, luckily, for us, but also sadly in terms of sort of what it means for wages, if you're going into a job where it's like, all you're doing is you're layering on empathy on top of GPT in a sort of in-person setting, that is just, there'll be tons of demand for that, but it won't be particularly, like that skill of empathy is not that rare, and so you won't get paid that much to do it. It's like not as anywhere near as rare as the doctor who today, right, who's kind of, there's not many of them and they have to do all these years of training and they get paid loads of money.
Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of adding value on top of language models, and the value you're adding is somewhat rare. So what are the kinds of value you can add? The first thing is sort of the generic point. Now let's be specific. Like what actually are those things? Okay. Right. I think the first thing is social skills. There's wonderful work by an economist called David Deming, who's at Harvard, and his kind of breakout paper a few years ago was characterizing occupations in terms of whether they've acquired high technical skills or high social skills. Or in particular, sort of 2x2 grid of like low technical, low social, low technical, high social, etc. Right? And looking sort of over the last, 30 years at wages for people in these different buckets. And it turned out that the only kind of people or jobs that have seen real sort of outlier, fantastic wage growth are those with high technical skills and high social skills. So if you just have high social skills and no technical skills, you've done pretty averagely. If you have just high technical skills and no social skills, you've also done pretty averagely, certainly in terms of sort of wage growth in recent decades. And if you've got neither, then even more so, not so good. Only those who've got both have done really well. And overall, there's been sort of a hugely increasing demand for social skills. I think that's only going to continue, as the economy gets more complex and LLMs are doing more of the sort of cognitive labor. There's going to be so much more, communication and decisions about what we actually care about to be made, and lots more client interaction and customization and, user interviewing and client relationship management and people management, all that kind of stuff. That's going to get relatively more important because those are the things that the language model cannot do.
But can it definitely not? Part of me is like, I don't know, Claude's like pretty, not just polite, but like friendly. I feel actually
it's friendly, it's graceful, it can write delicate emails really well. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's the thing that's missing there? Yeah.
So it has sort of, I guess it has sort of written down empathy. What it can't do is put you in a room and you and I are having a conversation and I like you now, right? Like, or, you made me feel heard, or respected or whatever it is. So I think, in a chatbot form, you can type to it and you can make you feel heard, right? that certainly is the case, right? But sort of these higher value forms of social skills and empathy, I think, and sort of, charisma, things which involve like direct human to human interaction. This stuff actually, I think, gets more important. And I think it's particularly important when interacted with the second thing I'm going to say, which is personal networks and trust. Those are valuable, right? What can Claude not do? It cannot introduce you to anyone. Claude cannot email on its behalf and say, hello, dear, expert Y or manager Z, my name's Claude. I'm an AI. I've got a great guy talking to me over here. I think he's really great. Would you mind, giving him a job or whatever it is, right? Like that doesn't happen. And when you get down to it, many, many, many occupations, industries, and certainly, most professional services. So kind of actually the kind of things where, on the one side, there's lots of impact that we are predicting from these language models. Things like bankers and lawyers and venture capitalists, they actually all rely on trust and relationships. Like their whole job is about building networks and building trust and like with other humans, i.e. with their clients or, investees or whatever it is. Or take journalists, for example, right? So we can all talk about, oh yeah, ChatGPT can like instantly write all the sort of the basic business news stories that as a result of, I don't know, analyst earning calls or like summarizing what's happened in Parliament this week or whatever it is, right? But kind of the really important stories that are investigative journalism where there is a source and a source has revealed something you were not supposed to reveal to a journalist because the journalist has made them feel trusted. That is a human thing in general, right? Because like, if you sort of email me today and be like, hello, my name is Claude. Can you tell me anything illegal happening in your workplace? Because I'm a bot, but like, trust me, it's all fine. And I'll help you get it into these. Like, you're like, no way. But like, you meet someone in a bar. I don't know how these things work with journalists, whatever, right? But sort of, I imagine there's all kinds of, trust building that goes on and it takes a long time. And certainly, I have had experiences with other kinds of kind of professional services providers, as in with me being on the receiving end of sort of trust building and like very human, takes a long time. It's all in person. It's not on email, let alone it's not on Zoom. It's all like the in-person is where it really happens. And there's going to be ever more of that. So I think that kind of ability to build trust and then in general, having a network, a personal network, professional network is only going to get, it's already extremely important. To an extent, I think most kind of people who are just starting in the labor market, straight out of school or university, don't quite appreciate. And I certainly did not appreciate until I was quite a long way in, but like, it is what makes everything kind of go round and how everything works. And that's only going to get more important, I think, over time. And so there's a general, theme about, as you go through the economy, ever more demand, as like work can be created to customize things ever more for each individual person. Certainly LLMs will be involved in that a ton on the sort of production side, but there's a huge scope for humans, working for these companies to be the sort of the ones interacting with you, the client. Okay, so tell me more. What kind of website do you want?
Right.
And let's do a brainstorming session. That'll be fun, won't it? And let me help introduce you to the right people in the bank to help you with this important transaction you're doing, or whatever it is, right? And so those kinds of jobs where you're basically schmoozing and building trust with people, like there's like limitless demand for all of that side of things.
Cool. Wow. Okay. That's loads of things, but it sounds like the theme is, charisma, networks and trust, general people skills, things that require people to be like, I like you and I trust you.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there any more on that?
So beyond the sort of social skills and to trust and that sort of things, there's another category here, which is around sort of management. We've touched a bit on it, but I think managing teams of AIs is going to look a bit different from managing teams of humans, and we're going to need lots of both. But I think the sort of thing that's really new here is, how do you manage
teams of AIs,
all these swarms? Hopefully not little swarms, but you as a whatever you're doing, you're a lawyer or you're a researcher, whatever. You've now got thousands of paralegals or research assistants equivalent. Like, what do you do with them and how do you orchestrate them? I think, there'll be plenty of places throughout the economy where people figure out standardized ways of orchestrating that kind of work, and it'll be embedded in software and it'll have performance guarantees and whatever. But there'll be also tons of the economy, the more sort of creative parts. I guess, I very much include artists and others here as well as the more creative kind of researchers or indeed lawyers, right? Where it's like, no. You can't use software for this. You can't use a sort of pre-baked sort of prompts and input-output understood thing. Like, your job is to like figure out, here's a completely novel problem. It's like edge of the art. You've got all these very smart RAs equivalent. Like, what do you ask them? What do you do with them? How do you check what they're telling you is correct in this like non-understood area where it's like you can't have performance guarantees because it's brand new? Right, so that will be a huge, really important skill. I think, to be honest, that today is now an incredibly important skill, particularly in research. If I was, in the middle of writing papers right now, I would, if I think back to sort of writing that paper we discussed, about the impact of AI on the job market, like that paper would have been so much easier to write in so many ways if I had access to GPT-4. And I would have written that paper, it would be much higher quality, and it would have been produced in probably a third of the time or a fifth of the time or something. And so if you are a researcher and you're not using these things or figuring out how to use them right now, then I think people who are thinking about that are going to probably outcompete you quite quickly, at least if they're competing directly with you in some sort of research niche or whatever it is.
Cool. Okay. I guess flipping the question around, what jobs will not be sensible to go into now because they'll be more automated soon, maybe completely?
That's a trickier one because there aren't that many jobs which consist only of the things that GPT-4 can do. So yeah, there are examples. So there was a news story recently of a bunch of people both in the US and I think often in the Philippines as well, who were kind of content writers, like very much sort of minimum wage type content writers, sort of content factories, right? And literally it was very direct and very clear. They were laid off and they were told directly it's because ChatGPT is better than you are, right? Because all they were doing is they were kind of outsourced labor. It was like text in, text out. And I was like, you know what? We don't need that anymore. And so probably shouldn't go and do that. But I think there's like tons of writing jobs that potentially, now you can be even better at because of GPT, and like you can earn more money in or like have a better career because you're bringing a really important extra thing. So I guess one of the things we haven't mentioned but is really important is what you often will bring is the context, right? So we obviously have to give context to these algorithms when we sort of ask them questions, right? And some these days, often the context is like, what do I want? And like it's an effort of imagination to sort of figure out how to, sort of grow yourself first about what you want, and then put that into the algorithm. And if you're in an organization of some kind doing work, or indeed working by yourself to be something of value, there's going to be a ton of context out there that the algorithm is not going to, it sort of by default pays attention to nothing, but has like everything it could pay attention to literally anything. And so you're sort of pointing it to a bit of the space of things it should pay attention to. And that might just be things it already knows about, but also might be, things that are just happening in the world, or things that are secrets that only you know because you've spoken to someone who knows something and that's not on the public internet yet, or whatever it is. And again, there's a lot of that in the world. And there's a huge amount of the economy of economic value is people knowing things before other people know them, or other kinds of sort of context that is not public. Huge factors of the economy are sort of things that are secret, basically, or not sort of not publicly available. You, as a human, can build up your stock of secrets. Or those secrets could be you did some user interviews with some humans and you talked to them, then you persuade them to talk to you, and no one else can get them to talk to you, and you ask them the right questions, and then you now know a lot about this kind of person, and that's really helpful for building products for them. Or you've been talking to politicians about what they really care about when it comes to this area of regulation, and like they were not taught to anyone, but they taught to you, and you're the only person who knows what these different politicians think about this question, right? Again, Claude cannot do that. GPT-4 cannot do that. Only you can do that. Maybe they'll help you write the questions, but like only you can get the context. And so, other areas of which there are many where kind of the scarce thing is the context, that feels to me a pretty safe bet for the future.
Michelle Hutchinson on finding what motivates you and reaching out to people for help.
Are there any common mistakes that you feel like you see people making that you think you could give advice on how to avoid?
I think one thing that I somewhat frequently see is people who think that some particular area is probably the highest impact one for them to go into, but don't feel terribly passionate about it and therefore relatively quickly rule it out. I think that seems more problematic because I think there's this really big difference in terms of how impactful different kinds of things are. But then I also think it comes back to this thing about people having some trouble introspecting before having tried something out, how much they'll like it. So I really try hard to push people, if they're in that kind of position, to think through specifically what kinds of things drive their motivation and whether there would be ways of being happy working in this area that they think is highest impact that would still motivate them. Because I think people are very different in terms of what kinds of things motivate them. So some people need to be seeing the beneficiaries in front of them all the time, and that's going to make it very difficult for you, for example, to work on a long-term horizon. Whereas other people, so I tend to be the kind of person who's very motivated by not letting my team down, which means that I can work in quite a lot of different areas. And then also by generally feeling like I'm helping people. So while I rationally think the reason that working at 8,000 hours is high impact is that it helps beneficiaries living many years in the future to not be wiped out, that kind of thing. On a day-to-day level, the thing that really keeps me going is it's great to be able to help people who are kind and want to have more impactful careers continue doing that. So I think it's really useful for people to get a sense of what their motivations might be like and then try out some of these things to see if they actually do suit them.
So it sounded like you were saying people would kind of suspect that they wouldn't enjoy a particular role, and then they kind of rule it out early on, even though they don't really have very strong evidence for that. And you're like, but if it's going to be 10 or 100 times more impactful, then maybe they should go and double check that and actually find out, figure out for sure whether they would enjoy it or not.
Yes, I think that's my sense.
Are there any other kind of common mistakes that people should look out for?
I think people don't reach out as much as they should be for advice to other people. People just actually really like helping each other. And so reaching out to people saying, hey, can I chat to you about your job? Can I get your thoughts on how I should apply for this kind of thing? And I think that works pretty broadly. So I found this really useful when I was setting up Center for Effective Altruism, originally reaching out to people who had already set up charities and saying, hey, can I pick your brain on what are the really important things to know when you're applying to Companies House and the charities commission for setting up an organization? And I was pretty surprised at the time just how helpful people were. Then when I was working at the Global Priorities Institute doing fundraising and doing grant applications. I was doing some on virtue ethics, which is a topic in philosophy that I knew very little about. And so I ended up sending the grant application that I had to the leading few virtue ethicists in the world. And I think 2 of the 3 of them replied and were willing to look over my application, which I just thought was really kind and somewhat unexpected. I think it's important to keep various things in mind when doing these kinds of reaching out, that you want to make sure that your emails are really concise, that it's very clear why you're reaching out to them and specifically what you want from them, so that they don't feel it's just like a cold email that went to lots of impressive people trying to generically network or something. But I think if you do those things and you give them, a CV so it's clear who you are, a 1-line on why you're reaching out to them specifically, and a 1-line on here's what I want, and it's a smallish ask, I think it's really surprising how often people are willing to respond. And this can also generalize to things like if you're interested in trying out being a researcher and you're still at university, it can be worth reaching out to professors in your university doing the kind of research you're interested in and saying, hey, are you interested in having a research assistant? Here is my background. Here's why I want to work with you. I really liked your 2 papers, this and this. Here's the kind of skills I have that might be useful for you, that kind of thing. And it can be really difficult to do, right? Because everyone's shy, no one likes rejection, you don't really even like imposing on people and feeling that you didn't get a response and so probably you imposed on them. But I think most people actually don't mind receiving emails like this, even if they don't have a chance to respond. And so it's really worth trying.
Benjamin Todd on figuring out if a career path is a good fit for you.
But you can kind of imagine normal careers advice is like kind of the opposite to us, where it would just start with like, okay, what are your strengths? That would be like the number 1 question. And then, then they wouldn't, that would be it actually. But then like with us, we kind of start from like, well, what does the world most need? Because I think that's like a really neglected perspective. And also like, well, if you want to have a big impact, it's really important to be actually thinking about like what will actually help people. And then we kind of work back from there and think, now, how can my strengths fit into that? So we do cover both ends of the spectrum, but we tend to emphasize what the world most needs more.
Yeah, I wonder if, in fact, it's fine, because maybe people are like more naturally inclined to think in terms of their personal circumstances and what they're good at, because, they've been being told since they were 11 that that's the way to choose your career. And emphasizing what the world needs even more than is like actually, justified if all else is equal is like maybe a good corrective.
Yeah, that's how I mainly feel about it.
Is there anything that you would recommend to readers to either read of ours or of somebody else's, or to do that would help them think better about their personal fit?
Yeah, well, one answer is I'm working on a like how to plan your career process, which we're going to put onto the website. And then the aim of that would be to kind of actually lead you through everything you need to think about, including your personal fit. And so hopefully if you work through that process, it will mean you've significantly thought about personal fit. Another thing is just whenever you're making a career decision, obviously do consider personal fit and bear in mind that it could outweigh which things seem most pressing in general. It could easily be that it's better to do something that you're good at, especially if you're focused on this more like transferable career capital focused thing that we were just talking about. And then, a third thing is like, I think it is worth people at some point reflecting on their strengths and trying to really clarify what they are. And there's a lot that could be said about how to figure out what your strengths are, and also just how to predict what you're going to be good at. That's like a whole difficult question in forecasting. But one perspective that I think gets a little bit neglected, even in like the mainstream talking about what your strengths are and what you're going to be good at, is not only thinking about kind of broad strokes, the area, like what might be a good fit, but also really thinking about the nitty-gritty day-to-day of the particular jobs. And trying to build up a picture of what does this job actually involve day-to-day, and could I see myself doing that and being motivated in it? And one exercise I found personally useful, it's got like slightly cheesy name of the energy audit. But basically what you do is you look at the last 2 weeks in your calendar, and then you try and categorize things by like energizing or not energizing. And then you try and think about how can you do the energizing ones more often. And you can use that within your role to kind of try to like design your role a bit better. But you can also use that to try to understand what actually are your strengths, like what are the types of activities, people to work with, skills that you find like most energizing, which is often a good sign of something that you might have good fit with.
I guess the other thing to say here is that oftentimes people can try the work or at least talk to somebody in the domain so that they can get a better sense of this day-to-day and a better sense of their fit with it. And I mean, this is a lot more applicable when people are early in their careers and they can spend a summer doing an internship. And this is, of course, common sense, but it's one thing maybe to emphasize.
Yeah, we could have a huge discussion about what are the best ways to predict personal fit. And one perspective is trying to predict it from the armchair. And then you've got a whole question of forecasting and like which predictors are most powerful. And then another perspective is how can you get more information and test things out and learn about them? And I think often people focus quite a bit on the armchair stuff. And often just by going to talk to someone in the career, you can learn like so much that's obviously really useful that's like a really good use of time.
Yeah. So I just listened to How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. And, one thing he hammers home is the more uncertain you are, the actually easier it is to reduce your uncertainty. Like if you know like practically nothing about an area, just talking to somebody for half an hour is probably going to like be a huge deal for making you understand what that path is like. So yeah, people who feel super uncertain, in fact, it's like be hopeful because it's easier to reduce your uncertainty.
Yeah, totally.
Chris Olah on the value of unusual combinations of skills.
All right, let's pick up and look at your, I guess, the kind of unconventional career track that you've been on in general, I guess from 2008 through 2015. Yeah, what do you think we could learn from this experience? Are there any lessons that listeners can draw as to their own experience? Or is it, I mean, maybe they should go and defend one of their friends from terrorism charges? I don't know. is there anything that people could learn? Or is it just too weird?
Well, okay, so I think probably the most useful thing I've extracted has been thinking about the Pareto frontier of skills. So, for example, a lot of my early contributions to machine learning were basically being able to create these really helpful illustrations of complicated ideas. What skills did I need to do that? Well, I needed both to understand machine learning and I needed to go and be able to draw. And I wasn't an exceptionally good artist or scientific illustrator. And I wasn't exceptionally knowledgeable about machine learning, but very plausibly for a while, I was the person in the world who was the best at the intersection of machine learning and drawing. And so if you sort of think of these two-dimensional plots of different skills or three-dimensional plots of different skills, and you think about the Pareto frontier, very often society is good at producing people who are optimized for a particular skill set of skills that society has really validated as useful. And we create entire pipelines training people. But I think that often, if you can find useful intersections of skills that aren't sort of these couple standard skills, there can be a lot of value, and it's much easier to go and have a big impact and often have a big counterfactual impact. And so I often think a lot, and when I'm talking to people about their own careers, I often try to frame it in terms of, what are the skills that they're cultivating, and sort of what do we think the Pareto frontier with regards to these skills looks like? And do we think that there's places where, rather than going and becoming the world's best at one skill, they could produce a lot of value by being at an intersection of skills that other people don't have?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess thinking about it theoretically, I suppose part of the reason is just that there's so many combinations of two different things that you could throw together. And so that the space of possible combinations is vastly larger. And so you have a lot more to choose from. And that means, and it also means that you could be the only person who's interested in X and Y if you choose two things that are sufficiently distant. And then you have a truly unique skill set, and you might just stumble on something that no one else has even tried to find.
Exactly. And now the problem is the space is exponentially big, and you want to not just find an intersection, but the intersection has to be useful. So you have to have some taste in sort of picking the skills that you develop. But I think that there are lots of opportunities like this, and that often it's much less competitive than going and being good at one of the skills that society already really values as a thing to optimize for.
Yeah, so I guess you could choose the wrong combination, just where there aren't that many complementarities between the two options. I guess you also kind of might fall between the cracks, I suppose, of existing disciplines. Or a common complaint that people have about doing interdisciplinary work is that, if you're doing, philosophy of economics, the economics department doesn't like you and the philosophy department doesn't like you, and no one really feels like you're one of them.
I guess I want to distinguish this a little bit from interdisciplinary work, which I think is something slightly different. When I was doing this scientific illustration of machine learning, it was really a pure machine learning contribution. It was something that was valuable to the machine learning community and targeted at the machine learning community. And so I think that there is a distinction, I think, between
skills and maybe bodies of knowledge.
Or you could also do something that was more cross-disciplinary. You could use machine learning for scientific drawing or something like this. But I think that's not really what I was doing.
Yeah. Okay. So I suppose we might be an example in that we're at the intersection of being knowledgeable about effective altruist ideas and research and I guess doing interviews and doing media and communicating stuff. That's maybe the unique selling point of this podcast. And I suppose, do you have like kind of examples of classic skills that you can throw onto something and then maybe produce something interesting that others haven't found?
I have a favorite example of this phenomenon, which I'll probably both slightly mistake and I actually owe to Michael Nielsen. But my understanding is that Richard Feynman, I guess when I don't know much about physics, but he had to do all this work sort of, and I guess physicists were doing all this work going and solving really complex integrals. And the usual set of techniques was to go and use tricks from complex analysis, analytic extensions and stuff like this, and try to go and solve the integrals that way. And Feynman didn't really know these complex analysis tools very well. But he had all of these weird tools around fractional calculus and stuff like this. And he used those instead. And by having a sort of, maybe this gets not even that weird a skill set, but in having a different skill set than his colleagues, he was able to have more counterfactual impact and go and solve problems that other people couldn't. And it's not that his tools were better. It's just that lots of people were already trying with the other tools. And he brought a different set of tools to the table.
Yeah, so found some money lying on the sidewalk. I guess some options might be, knowing a lot about some technical area, plus say knowing about operations in organizations, or knowing about how to do business, or knowing about money, knowing how to manage people. Maybe those are like combinations.
I think people management plus technical skills is a huge superpower. I think it's something that I am trying to become good at. I think the people who I see who are really good at it, I think it's a really amazing thing.
Yeah, they end up very sought after.
I think any sort of communication plus technical skill, I think web development plus science is actually really underrated. I think that often being able to build interactive interfaces can allow you to go and, I guess the basic pitch is, I think a lot of scientists are drawn towards very reductionist, and maybe this is more true in machine learning than other fields, I'm not sure, but they tend to go and look for summary statistics because they can sort of easily work with summary statistics and make line plots and things like this. And I think if you instead are able to go and create interactive tools and explore things, you tend to just sort of interact with the data in a different way. And I think there's actually just it's something where, at least in machine learning, I think there's a lot of value that gets left on the table, and I suspect elsewhere.
Yeah. Do you think that this might be slightly a Bay Area phenomenon? The thing is, like, people really appreciating people who have quirky skills that are combined. And that maybe if you're in a more conservative social situation, maybe you'll be more risky, or is that wrong?
Yeah, that might be true. Although I think in a lot of cases, it's like if you can demonstrate that your intersection of skills produces value, I think that's really the critical thing. Like once an organization is getting value out of your intersection of skills, whether it's weird or not, probably isn't going to be the critical thing.
Yeah, the make or break issue. Yeah, I guess that's maybe one other lesson is that if you can show people that you can do stuff directly, then often you can route around credentials. And I think that is quite often true. The thing is, it actually is potentially quite hard to figure out how to produce value and how to do a good job without having the training. So it requires someone who really has either just a lot of raw ability or a lot of focus or a lot of discipline to do things outside of a structured environment.
Absolutely. And I think it also depends a lot on the discipline. Like, practicing law without credentials isn't something that's going to fly.
Yeah, I think probably people aren't just going to learn medicine through apprenticeships. That would be, for understandable reasons, it's a somewhat credential field.
I would be very nervous to go and have a doctor who did not have an MD.
Yeah, I guess it reminds me of what you can get like a free haircut if you're willing to be someone's first victim as receiving a haircut. Perhaps it's more difficult in a surgical environment.
Holden Karnofsky and deciding which weird ideas are worth betting on.
A general property of the way that I think across the board, that has always been the case, is just that I'm much less inclined than average to reject ideas because they seem weird. And I think that might come in part from just a kind of contrarian instinct, or, I enjoy playing around with ideas and having ideas that are different than other people. But I do also think, separately, I think it can be justified just because people want to say, I don't want to accept that. I don't want to take that very seriously because it's weird. But people's calibration of what is weird is just based on what they've already observed. And if you look at history and you look at like how people's views of physics and economics and all these other, and like religion, and how all of this has changed, people in the past would think that the things that we believe and are doing now are absolutely bizarre. And, if you went and got a hunter-gatherer and brought them to the modern world, they would just be completely astonished, to the same degree probably that we would be by a future involving digital people and artificial intelligence. So I just kind of want to make the claim that it's not safe to reject ideas that are weird in physics or in social science or in predicting the future. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think what you're saying is true, although I also think a lot of people really are better off doing exactly what you're criticizing. Like a lot of people are going to have much better lives if they reject things that are weird, even if they seem true. Like there's a lot of bad ideas out there. And let's say you're a person and you kind of grow up and it's like, you don't want to go to school, but everyone kind of tells you to go to school. It'd be weird if you didn't. You go to school. Then you don't want to get a job, but I don't know. You see everyone getting a job, so you get a job. And then like a bunch of cults come knocking on your door, and what they're saying sounds really exciting, but it's weird, so you don't do it. And I think you just won. Like I think that went really well for you. And it's true that, okay, the job you took was a weird job that people in the year 200 would have not imagined. And it's true that there will be other jobs in a million, but you did good. You did good, and that worked out well for you. And so I don't think that it's crazy to have this anti-weirdness heuristic. I really don't. I think what it is good is to evaluate it and poke it and think about it over time, because I think it's like what I've been trying to do with my life is think about like, what are the weird things that turn out to actually be pretty reasonable? And what are the weird things that I can just dismiss out of hand? And what are the patterns in that? It's like, what kinds of people should I be taking more seriously? What kinds of introductions and language and styles are correlated with someone who's about to change my mind for real instead of someone who's about to lead me on a wild goose chase? And I think that stuff's really important. So I'm not, I honestly, I can't say I've ever been a person who's very sympathetic to like, here's a 4-part logical argument that I delivered in 5 minutes. Now go change what you're doing with your life. I've really never been a fan of that. I've always, and you can see the way that I've done things in my careers. I've always wanted to do my homework before I make a big bet. And there maybe you're one of those people. I don't think I am. Maybe you're one of those people who just like, you just have awesome intuitions. And it's just like, you're blessed. And like, when things make sense to you in 5 minutes, that's just because they make sense. And if something is stupid, you'll see the problem with it immediately. And you just have this gift, and that's great. But I don't think I have that gift, and I also wouldn't know initially if I did. So I'm into kind of watching as you go through life, and a thing that I've gone through life is I've kind of been like, certain kinds of weird are worth looking into further and may just be worth betting on. And there are certain kinds of things that it has not been helpful to me to dismiss because they're weird, and I want to do less dismissing of those things. And then you get this sort of accelerated self-improvement in your beliefs when you have that attitude, because you're learning, I learn about, it's like I was studying when I was at GiveWell. It's like we were learning about bed nets and deworming, but we were also learning about what kinds of studies to trust and what kinds of people to trust, and who turns out to be right when you learn more and who turns out to be wrong when you learn more, and what weird stuff turns out to be crazy and what weird stuff turns out to be exactly the sort of thing you should have been doing. And so it's like, I'm trying to do this meta learning at the same time as I'm doing this learning. And now I've got a pretty well-developed sense of what kind of weird do I want to ignore, or what kind of weird do I want to get into? So that would be more the way I'd put it.
Yeah.
I do agree you shouldn't, a lifelong rule of dismiss everything just because it's weird, it seems like it has to leave you short of your potential to do amazing things. It may also stop you from doing really stupid things. So I do agree with that part.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess there is a pretty big distinction between how willing are you to do things that are completely nonconformist in your lifestyle or life choices, where people can learn a lot from experience, and like how much should you do that in what is effectively a research project where you're trying to get ahead of the crowd, or like entrepreneurship. It's a style of entrepreneurship where you're trying to get ahead of the crowd and figure things out so you can either make more money or do more good. And in that case, rejecting things that are weird just almost certainly means that you're going to fail, because the only way to,
once you get into the business where your whole thing is upside, like you're, essentially at a startup and you just want to like do something amazing, and that's your goal. That's a lot of people is not their professional goal. Once it is, then it becomes extremely costly to just be dismissive of weird stuff. Although at the same time, it's like you got to preserve your time to be able to look into the most important weird stuff. So you can't go chasing down every weird thing that sounds like it might be true. You have to have some way of distinguishing.
Karen Levy on traveling to learn about yourself.
You've been around, you've experienced a bunch of things. Is there any kind of underrated or valuable life advice that you like to tell people that I haven't yet given you the chance to share?
Well, maybe unsurprisingly, based on what I just said about my experiences in Kenya, I would really advise people, particularly those who are interested in global health and development, to spend a substantial amount of time living somewhere other than where you grew up. And this is not only because you learn about new places, as valuable as that is, but really it's because of what you learn about yourself and where you come from. We expect to feel a sense of culture shock when we visit somewhere new. But when you spend long enough far from home, you get to experience that feeling about your own home place and culture and see it with new eyes. And it helps you understand how much is socially constructed. It helps you see kind of the illogic or the internal contradictions of where you come from. And I think it actually really helps to develop this scout mindset, that Julia Galef talks about. The ability to observe and question what you take for granted as true or obvious or normal, right? And in this line of work in particular, I think it's really critical for us to approach other cultures and institutions with the presumption that they probably have some of their own internal logic, and it's incumbent upon us to try and understand it. And that conversely, we have lots of views and assumptions that are not necessarily logical or true, and that we should really be willing to question them.
Yeah. Anything else?
Well, I will just end by sharing one of my favorite stories about this very topic. Some of the work I did in my earliest days in Kenya was running study abroad programs for American high school and college students in Kenya. And, not surprisingly, they, as I was when I first came to Kenya, were always kind of very interested in the exotic, right? I mean, that's kind of what attracts us. And so, I would often get questions, especially if we were visiting a rural area, about, tribal dances or ethnic practices or things like this, okay? And so one of my very favorite things to do with groups of students in talking about, cultural practices and quote, tribal traditions is I would say, well, everybody has tribal dances. And they would say, well, everybody but us, right? It's the equivalent of like everyone else has an accent and I speak normally, right? And so I would say, no, absolutely everyone has tribal dances and everyone would be very, suspect of this. And so I'd say, okay, everybody get up, stand in a circle, okay? And everybody would get up and stand in a circle. And then I would say, you put your right hand in, you put your right hand out. And of course, everybody knows the hokey pokey, right? And what is the hokey pokey if not an American tribal dance, right? And so this was always one of my favorite examples to kind of get people to think about this very issue that we're talking about. We all have culture. We all have bias. We all are exotic. We're all irrational, right? And being able to see your own place through those eyes, I think really helps us develop a sense of inquisitiveness and truth-seeking about the world that I think is very valuable.
Leah Garcés on finding common ground with unlikely allies.
Yeah, let's talk about your book, Grilled, which came out in 2019. Yeah, in that book, you cover, I guess, a lot of ground about your personal background, your work over the last couple of decades, and how you've had various successes over the years. I guess for our conversation, I'm keen to focus in on the cases where you formed quite constructive relationships with folks like chicken farmers and executives at big meat companies, which is somewhat surprising, and these kind of relationships flourished somewhat against the odds. Analyzing the process that you've been through, what do you think other people focused on social reform should kind of take away from the experiences that you document in Grilled?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first one is that we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and that only talking to people who agree with us won't get us to the solution. So recognizing that the opponent quite often has the power to solve the problem and that I don't. So for example, I don't care for a single chicken. The farmer does and Purdue does. So in order to understand how to unpick this problem and end it, I have to speak to the people who are in control of it. So uncomfortable being uncomfortable. Another one is the simple thing of being willing to sit down and recognize that the person across from you is a human being and has come to the decisions they've made out of a complex, human mind. And they will have made decisions that you will not be aware of. And sitting down with them and making that connection is really important. And this is something that comes through a lot of negotiation. If you work on business negotiation, it's the same thing. Like, find the common football team that you both like or baseball team that you both like. Make those common connections. In my case, I sat down with one particular chicken executive, and both of us had adopted children. And so we were able to connect and forget that we were supposed to be enemies in that moment and talk about that experience. And some walls came down and some trust was built because I recognized he was a human being and made that connection. And the last thing is to look for win-wins and start there rather than start with what you disagree with. So in the case of Craig Watts, I started to think about how could I find him a different job rather than how do I just end his job? Like you were saying, how do I just give him $0? Well, no, how do I look for the place? It'll be faster and more efficient if we can find solutions where everybody wins because they'll be more willing to come with us. We won't have to spend resources fighting them. Instead, they'll just willingly come. So how can we find solutions where everybody is winning? It's not always possible, but you should look there first.
Yeah, on the first one about building relationships with people, as I was reading the book, I was thinking there's different interpretations you could have of events. One would be that the personal connections that you built, finding that you had both adopted children, that you bagged for the same football team or whatever, that those personal connections were able to move the needle and to build trust and potentially get movement on a bunch of policy areas where otherwise it wouldn't happen, which is entirely possible. An alternative interpretation might be that because these companies were scared of mercy for animals, because they were scared of the damage that they might suffer, and perhaps, looking again at the numbers, they were like, actually making some of these reforms won't be as costly as we'll think, and we're probably going to be forced to do it anyway, so maybe let's just get ahead. It's actually like a perfectly fine business decision. Those business considerations made possible the relationship. And so where previously they were unwilling to talk to you because they decided to change anyway, now they wanted to build a more collaborative relationship. I guess it could be quite difficult to distinguish these two cases, and to some extent they kind of blur together. But what do you make of that?
I think both, like I said earlier, recognizing that there's a PR risk of continuing to abuse animals and knowing that that is out there. And if your brand especially is tied to quality or caring or being better than others, then you're at risk. And so I always present to companies, animal welfare can be a risk or a benefit for you. You do it badly, that's a huge risk because here comes an undercover investigator to show what's going on. Or it can be a benefit if you do it well and you're leapfrogging ahead of your competitors. Consumers are only caring more and more about this issue, not less, and they're able to access more and more information, and we're able to get more and more footage. I also think, I had a capacity to make personal relations and a curiosity, a kind of, almost like I could never satisfy my curiosity. I always liked understanding other people's perspectives, and I was always curious about how people came to different conclusions than me. And so I think that did help too, to explore that and make me more willing to be uncomfortable talking to others.
There's some other organizations in the animal space, I guess the Humane League jumps to mind, that take a somewhat more adversarial approach and might be less inclined to form relationships like the ones that you've done. I suppose I recall the story that there was you were talking to someone, I think they were in charge of communications or some other aspect of a chicken company. And they were saying, I would love to make these changes for animals that you're suggesting, but the public doesn't care enough as yet. So you need to go out there and make a big fuss so that the most profitable thing for us to do is to adopt the reforms. And then I'll be able to push it through within the company, but because it will be a good business decision, which I guess kind of blurs the line between, it's like, is that an adversarial relationship now, or is that a collaborative one? I guess it's a little bit of both. What is kind of the right mix, do you think, of these adversarial approaches where you kind of do use the stick and other times when you when you use the carrot? And I guess how can we know how to strike the right balance as a movement as a whole?
The short answer is you need both, but we always start with a cooperative effort because it's more efficient. It's less resources. If you can sit down with someone and get them to do what you feel is the correct pathway, that's going to cost less time and money. So you should always ask first. You should always sit down and say, what are the barriers? Is there anything I can do about those barriers? What's the resistance? Is there anything I can do about that? But like Costco example, we sat down with them for a year and it was very clear they just didn't care. It didn't matter. And the only thing that was going to work, and this should be a last resort, should be public campaigning because it is so costly. And that was the resort we had to move to. That was the move we had to take because it was clear nothing else was going to work except really thinking through exposing them publicly for the realities on their farm that they were benefiting from economically. So it has to be both, but I always start with cooperative because it costs less, it's more efficient, and it moves us along faster.
That makes sense. So I guess the bottom line is, you reach out the hand, try to form a cooperative relationship. If that doesn't work, then you have to be adversarial. But then as soon as they're willing to deal with you, then you want to switch to that because this is going to be so much cheaper and so much faster.
100%. Yeah.
Spencer Greenberg on recognizing toxic people who could derail your career and life.
On the show before in previous interviews, I think we've sometimes listed what are the key ways that your life can go super wrong, and said you should really keep these, sometimes people really go off the rails, right? And there's really only a few ways that happens, and you should be aware of those and steer very clear of them. And I guess one of them was commit a crime or some other like severe wrongdoing against others, even if it's not technically a crime. Drug addiction, and I guess not all drugs are created equal in that. There's some that have a pretty bad track record. Not treating severe mental health problems seriously, or not having a severe health problem and just not getting that addressed at all, or maybe because you're in denial. And I would say actually another category that we haven't talked about on the show before, but I think is another way to really mess up your life in a big way is to get very close to someone who is cruel or exploitative. Allowing them to become a really close friend or a colleague or a partner, like starting a business with someone who is really bad news. It's this can have a very negative effect on your life, and it's something that people should go out of their way to not have happen.
I 100% agree. I think it's a really common reason people's lives get really messed up is they kind of attach themselves through marriage, through working relationships, just even sometimes through deep friendship with people that are very harmful. And someone can be very harmful without being a bad person. And so there's I would draw that distinction there. But there's some people that are good people but are still very harmful. And so, but I think learning to notice the signs and it doesn't mean you can't interact with the person at all. Maybe you could still, hang out with them casually, but like keeping a level of distance where they're not so involved in your life that they can like ruin your life. I think that's the key thing. And honestly, I've been burned incredibly badly by this. Where there have been people in my life that I think are quite harmful people and that have hurt me tremendously.
Yeah. I was going to say, I feel like kind of everyone who lives a normal life, or I suppose anyone who's not extremely lucky, as you become a teenager, as you become an adult, you learn through experience, through bitter experience often, about these warning signs, and that not everyone is maybe as nice as the people you knew when you were a child, and that some people really are quite toxic. But it does feel like it's something that it's very hard to teach people. It's very hard to find a 17-year-old and sit them down and say, here's a list of things. Like if someone has these traits, you should really be wary. It feels like people don't take that as seriously as maybe they should until they've had negative experiences. And I think there's a similar dynamic actually in business that people who are early in their careers often don't appreciate how harmful it is to make a bad hire, to hire someone who is either a toxic person or just extremely incompetent.
Employee is like, is a harmful person. That's can absolutely be devastating and ruin your whole business, actually.
Yeah, and I feel most people have a story of like, at some point they made a bad hire and then they realized how important hiring was and how important it was to actually go and call references and things like that.
But it's also tricky because like you might have a really bad relationship, get burned by someone who's very harmful, but then you might not update on, well, what are all the signs of being harmful, right? You just like over anchor on the details of that person without seeing the more general pattern. So we did a little qualitative study where we had 100 people answer the following question, just in an open-ended format. They could say anything they wanted. And we asked them, what signs do you look for that help you identify people who are likely to be untrustworthy or who are likely to hurt you if they become a close friend or partner? And we then took all their responses and we kind of synthesized them to look at what are the patterns of what they're saying, where like multiple people are saying the same thing. And we kind of broke down each of the things that were patterns into kind of discrete signs to look out for. And I thought it was pretty interesting because I wasn't sure if I was going to agree with what people said, but I found out really I did agree to a very large extent with what people end up producing. And they also got me through their answers to get me to think about things that I may not have thought to put, but I'm like, oh yeah, that actually is a pretty good thing to look out for. Yeah.
What were the headline findings?
Yeah, so here are the kind of patterns that emerged. And before we get into them, I will say, almost everyone will sometimes show these patterns. So the idea is not if someone ever shows one of these patterns, they're bad news. It's more like, think about it as a continuum, right? If someone repeatedly shows these patterns to a strong degree, you might question whether that they're a safe person or whether they might be untrustworthy or hurt you. So let's dig into the specific things. So the first set of patterns are around things you might call like dangerous psychopathy or malignant narcissism. And so the things like you notice that the person seems to be manipulating you or other people. You notice that they're inconsistent, like they'll say one thing one time and a different thing at another time, or you catch them being dishonest. And again, it could be to you, or maybe you just see them being honest with other people, right? A self-centeredness where they seem much more interested in their own interests than in other people's interests. Quick, very intense anger, so they suddenly become enraged. And then finally, lack of empathy. And I think what this cluster is really getting at are two personality disorders. antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. And I will say, not everyone with these disorders should be avoided. Like there can be people who are good, ethical people who have these disorders, especially if they understand that they have these disorders, they're seeking treatment, they're working on themselves, they have other compensating factors that help them avoid some of the dangers of having these disorders. But when you have someone who has these disorders to a strong degree, they're in total denial, they're not working on it at all, it can pose quite a bit of danger.
Be on your guard.
You should be on your guard and just be careful and know what you're getting yourself into.
There's this classic idea that on a first date you should see whether the other person is nice to the waiter at the restaurant, and if they're a jerk to them, that's a sign that they maybe don't care about people who aren't in a stronger position of power as them. And I guess I'm not sure, maybe this falls into another cluster you're about to mention, but it seems like it might fall into that one.
Yeah, well, you could see that being like lack of empathy, for example. It could be a sign of lack of empathy. Yeah, so that's just one set of things to look at. The second cluster is around immaturity. And so this would be things like extreme emotionality, like the person gets extremely upset over very minor seeming things. The person seems to avoid topics when they're upset. So instead of like telling you, oh, that bothered me, they just like won't talk about it, or they'll shut down. They have really poor communication. Lacking responsibility or accountability, like maybe they mess up, but they refuse to apologize, or they just won't take any accountability for what they did. And in general, poor handling of relationships. Like if you see they have a bad relationship with everyone else in their life, like that's not a great sign. And I think this immaturity category, maybe it's not as potentially serious, but I think it really can be a red flag in relationships where you could get in a really bad pickle where someone like do something that's harmful, but then they don't take responsibility for it, or they'll be really angry at you about something that maybe you did a really minor mistake, but it wasn't that serious, according to relatively objective third-party observers. But this person's extremely upset about it, but then they don't even tell you, and they're just simmering with rage at you. So there's a lot of things that I think can come out here that actually I do think it's a pretty important cluster.
Could make someone a difficult colleague as well. I imagine if you can't have frank conversations about what things have gone well and badly. Okay, absolutely. So that was second cluster. What's there's a third, right?
The third and final cluster is a pettiness cluster. So this would be things like they talk negatively about a lot of people, like for saying negative things about their other friends to you, gossiping in a way that's harmful, where they're like spreading information that could hurt people, and extreme judgmentalness, where they're like, oh well, that person sucks because of this little minor defect. So this category, the pettiness, I don't think I would have thought of this category, but I do see why it can kind of be insidious, where someone can be causing harm in a social group through these kind of behaviors.
Yeah, I wonder whether it indicates that people might do that as part of their social positioning. So maybe they're trying to undermine the status of other people in a group in order to big themselves up in relative terms, and that's not very. I mean, of course, everyone has done that at some point in their life, at least once. But it's maybe not a good thing to be doing on the very, very regularly. It's trying to raise your own position by dragging other people down rather than delivering value to people around you.
Yeah, it's almost like a negative sum kind of behavior where you're damaging other people's reputations in a way that. Clearly, we don't want everyone in society doing that. That would just be, It seems like that would lead to very bad outcomes. So those are just three categories to think about. Again, none of them are hard and fast rules. They're all on a spectrum. But if someone is showing these kind of manipulative or very self-centered or very sudden rage kind of behaviors, that's in the first category. They're showing a lot of immaturity, like failure to acknowledge their mistakes, really bad communication, seem to be fighting with everyone in their life. That's the immaturity category. And then finally, the pettiness category. Just things to be on the lookout for to help you avoid people that might hurt you. Hopefully a list like this can help accelerate people a little bit. Just getting them thinking about what are the different signs you might want to look out for.
Holden Karnofsky on the many jobs that can help with AI.
What's another way that some listeners might be able to help with this general issue by changing the career that they go into or the skills that they develop?
Yeah, so I wrote a post on this called Jobs That Can Help with the Most Important Century. I think the first thing I want to say is I just do expect this stuff to be quite dynamic. So right now, I think we're in a very nascent phase of kind of evals and standards. I think we could be in a future world where there are decent tests of whether AI systems are dangerous, and there are decent frameworks for how to keep them safe. But there needs to be just more work on advocacy and communication so that people actually understand this stuff, take it seriously, and that there is a reason for companies to do this. And also, there could be people working on political advocacy to have good regulatory frameworks for keeping humanity safe. So I think the jobs that exist are going to change a lot. And I think my big thing about careers in general is just like, if you're not finding a great fit with one of the current things, that's fine. And like, don't force it. And, if you have person A and person B, and person A is like, they're doing something that's not clearly relevant to AI or whatever. Let's say they're an accountant. They're really good at it. They're thriving. They're picking up skills. They're making connections. And they're ready to go work on AI as soon as an opportunity comes up, which that last part can be hard to do on a personal level. Then you have person B who is, kind of like, they had a similar profile, but they forced themselves to go into alignment research, and they're like doing quite mediocre alignment research. So they're like barely keeping their job. I would say person A is just like the higher expected impact. And I think that would be my main thing on jobs is I'm just like, do something where you're good at it, you're thriving, you're leveling up, you're picking up skills, you're picking up connections. If that thing can be on a key AI priority, that is ideal. If it cannot be, that's okay, and don't force it. So that is my high level thing. But I'm happy to talk about specifically what I see as some of the things people could do today, right now, on AI that don't require starting your own org and are more like you can slot into an existing team if you have the skills and if you have the fit. I'm happy to go into that.
Yeah, I think people who want more advice on overall career strategy, we did an episode with you on that back in 2021, which is episode 110, Holden Karnofsky on building aptitudes and kicking ass. So I can definitely recommend going back and listening to that. But yeah, maybe in terms of like more specific roles, are there any ones that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are obvious. So I think, there's people working on AI alignment. There's also people working on threat assessment, which we've talked about, and dangerous capability evaluations at AI labs or sometimes at nonprofits. And, if there's a fit there, I think that's just like an obviously great thing to be working on. We've talked about information security. I don't think we need to say more about that. I think there is this like really tough question of whether you should go to an AI company and just kind of like do things there that are not particularly safety or policy or security, just like helping the company succeed. That can be a really, in my opinion, really great way to skill up. A really great way to like you personally becoming a person who knows a lot about AI, understands AI, swims in the water, and is well positioned to do something else later. There's big upsides and big downsides to helping an AI company succeed at what it's doing, and it really comes down to how you feel about the company. So it's a tricky one, but it's one that I think is definitely worth thinking about carefully. Then there's roles in government, and there's roles in government-facing think tanks, just trying to help. And I think that the interest is growing. So trying to help the government make good decisions, including not making rash moves about how it's dealing with AI policy, what it's regulating, what it's not regulating, et cetera. So those are some things. I had a few other listed in my post, but I think it's okay to stop there.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it seems like both of these paths. So one, broadly speaking, was going and working in the AI labs or in nearby industries or firms that they collaborate with. And I guess there's a whole lot of different ways you could have impact there. And I suppose the other one is thinking about governance and policy, where you could pursue any kind of government and policy career, try to flourish as much as you can, and then turn your attention towards AI later on. Right. Because there's sure to be an enormous demand for more analysis and work on this in coming years. So hopefully in both cases you'll be joining very rapidly growing industries.
And for the latter, the closer the better. So if working on technology policy is probably best. But yeah.
What about people who they don't see any immediate opportunity to enter into either of those broad streams? Is there anything that you think that they could do in the meantime?
Yeah, so I did before talk about the kind of person who could, just be good at something and kind of wait for something to come up later. I guess it might be worth emphasizing the ability to switch careers is going to get harder and harder as you get further and further into your career. So I think in some ways, like, if you're a person who's being successful, but is also like making sure that you've got the financial resources, the social resources, the psychological resources, that you really feel confident that as soon as a good opportunity comes up to do a lot of good, you're going to switch jobs or have a lot of time to serve on a board or whatever. I think it's weird because this is like not a measurable thing, and it's not a thing you can like brag about when you go to an effective altruism meetup. It just seems like incredibly valuable. And I wish there was a way to just kind of recognize that, the person who is successfully able to walk when they need to from a successful career has, in my mind, like more expected impact than the person who's in the high impact career right now, but is not killing it.
Yeah. So I expect an enormous growth in roles that might be relevant to this problem in future years, and also just an increasing number of types of roles that might be relevant, because there could just be all kinds of new projects that are going to grow and will require people who are just generally competent, who have management experience, who know how to deal with operations and legal and so on. So and they're going to be looking for people who share their values. So if you're able to potentially move to one of the hubs and take one of those roles when it becomes available, if it does, then that's definitely a big step up relative to locking yourself into something else where you can't shift.
I was going to say also just like spreading messages we talked about, but I have a feeling that being a person who's a good communicator, a good advocate, a good persuader, I have a feeling that's going to become more and more relevant, and there's going to be more and more jobs like that over time, because I think we're in a place now where people are like just starting to figure out what a good regulatory regime might look like, what a good set of practices might look like for containing the danger. And later, I think there'll be more maturity there and more stress placed on, and people need to actually understand this and care about it and do it.
Yeah, I mean, setting yourself the challenge of taking someone who is not informed about this or might even be skeptical about this, and with arguments that are actually sound, as far as you know, persuading them to care about it for the right reasons and to understand it deeply, that is not simple. And if you're able to build the skill of doing that through practice, it would be unsurprising if that turned out to be very useful in some role in future.
And I should be clear, there's a zillion versions of that have like dramatically different skill sets. So there's like people who, their thing is they work in government, and there's some kind of government subculture that they're very good at communicating with, and government ease. And then there's people who like make viral videos. Then there's people who like organize grassroots protests. And there's so many. There's journalists, there's highbrow journalists, lowbrow journalists. It's just like, communication is not a generalizable skill. It's there's an audience, and there's a gazillion audiences, and there are people who are terrible with some audiences and amazing with other ones. So this is many, many jobs, and I think there'll be more and more over time.
Danny Hernandez on using world events to trigger you to work on something else.
Is there any sort of underappreciated idea that you think our listeners would benefit from hearing?
Yeah, I mean, something that you guys talked about, that Alan Defoe talked about on one of your guys' podcasts was that he had decided that he was going to work on kind of AI policy once we beat Go, that was like going to be his trigger. He could kind of like ignore AI until that happened, and then he would work on it. And I think this is like a very good way of viewing things that there isn't a lot of evidence for right now, or that the evidence seems too murky or like too small amounts of it to make a decision, is to just be like, what would be enough evidence for me to like pay attention to this thing or to start working on it? And, to think about those kinds of triggers for people's major decisions around AI or around other things.
I mean, it must be kind of hard to pick a trigger, right? And then not reconsider it. I could imagine like picking the Go trigger, but then you get there and you're like, oh, but I was misguided. I didn't realize how not impressive that was, or this is going to be, or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's some downside. I mean, I think what happens otherwise is that it's like reality is unsurprising, and like you just think that you expected that. So I think there's trade-offs.
That there was a time when you didn't expect that to be business as usual.
I think commitments like that you should maybe think of as like 80 or 90% commitments or something. Like you haven't literally bound your hands, but this is kind of your strong intention as to like what would convince you. And yeah, I think that's like a thing to do. I think another way you could phrase it is, if you believe AI progress is fast, what would progress look like that would convince you it's slow? Paint a picture of that. 5 years from now, what does slow progress look like to you? And now you're like, oh yeah, progress is actually slow. And what could have happened that would convince you it's actually fast? That you can make what would update you clear to yourself and others, and that like for big decisions, this is like generally worthwhile. It's like a lot of rigor to do for smaller things. Yeah, I like to think about this.
Yeah, I guess it's another version, I guess, of getting precise about your beliefs.
Yeah, that's my style.
Sarah Eustis-Guthrie on exploring and pivoting in careers.
So I think 80,000 Hours recommends lots of people try out a particular career path. And then lots of those people have to figure out, like, is this the right thing? Should I keep investing in this thing and making this bet? And sometimes they have to decide, actually, no, I shouldn't continue down that career path. So I think this is actually like, this question of how to decide whether to like double down or pivot is really, really important and really broadly applicable. How do you think that, I guess, organizations, but also individuals should think about how and whether to continue on their bet or pivot, do something else?
I think that's a great question. It's certainly something I think about all the time. I think the most important part is to think clearly about what path you're on, what the different assumptions are that would suggest that that's a really good path, and try to dig into, are there ways that you could try and test those assumptions? What is the balance of the evidence in one direction or the other that suggests that maybe this is a really good path or maybe this is a bad path? So kind of thinking really clearly about this, for me, I think that usually looks like a spreadsheet. So I know for postpartum family planning, I made this big spreadsheet that was like, what are the biggest concerns about it as an intervention? How certain am I in each of these concerns? How much does this concern affect the bottom line impact of the intervention? And then talking to a bunch of different people and getting their input into it. And I think it's important to remember as a baseline that you are going to be uncertain on every decision to some extent. And you have to say, what's the level of uncertainty that I'm comfortable with? But I have these uncertainties. But the fact that I have so many uncertainties that like are of sufficient size and affect the bottom line so much that that's just like greater than the amount of uncertainties that I'm comfortable with, or comparing it to comparable options. And so I think that if you can be as clear as possible in articulating what you believe and creating opportunities for yourself where you can maybe test the truth, the ground level truth of that assumption, is really important. And I think that's extra tough when you're working in really speculative areas. So maybe you're thinking about something that's far off in the future or that's really speculative. But I think if you can at least concretely articulate, like, this is exactly how speculative it is, that makes a big difference in how well you can think about it.
Yeah. A kind of related idea that's helped me is assessing how speculative a project is and estimating the chances of success or failure. If the project seems worth doing, given those odds, I give it my best shot and aim to think of it as a good and worthwhile bet, even if it doesn't work out. Then I set a time frame, could be 3 months, to gather more information and kind of test things out. And if I reach a point where things look promising, I continue at that kind of 3-month mark. And that would be a success. But if not, and I kind of decide to stop doing the project because it wasn't as successful a test as I was hoping, then that is also a success. So kind of thinking of it as, regardless of the outcome, I've followed my plan and made good choices with the information I have.
Right. I am the world's biggest advocate of reevaluation points. I think that everyone should have reevaluation points, both personally and organizationally, where you're going to sit down and you're going to say, okay, we have this strategy. Our whole approach rests on these assumptions. Actually, A, should we have these assumptions in the first place? And B, how well are we actually doing in achieving this thing? Maybe there's different approaches to achieving our goal in a better way that's more effective. And I think that the genius of reevaluation points is that it both ensures that you have a time when you're going to be reflecting on your approach, and it also gives you permission to set aside your concerns on a day-to-day basis. Yes. So you write down that concern in your reevaluation doc, and then you go back to regular life, and you know that you're going to have a moment where you can come back and say, wait a minute, is this actually a good idea? And I think that it's really easy for organizations to not do this. So someone from a very large charity came up to me after a talk I gave on this topic and said, yeah, we totally don't do this at all. And I was really surprised because I guess I just kind of figured that everyone did this. But the fact of the matter is, I think that this kind of big picture strategic thinking just isn't often incentivized. And so you're maybe like, if your funder isn't going to pay for you to spend some time doing this thing, I mean, that's where you get all your money. So you're not going to spend time doing this thing. So I think it's really important as individuals and as organizations to be intentional about this, having this kind of reevaluation point. Because if it turns out that you were doing a suboptimal thing all along, like, that's a big problem.
Benjamin Todd on making tough, career decisions.
Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of different considerations that people could bring to bear when planning out their career. Is it possible to kind of bring this into any kind of like cohesive decision-making process, kind of a step-by-step process that people can use to do all of these things in a way that's
funny
not
you should
overwhelming?
say that. We have just what you're looking for.
We didn't plan this ahead of time, listeners. It's all spontaneous.
One we call the process summary, which is like just what are the steps to go through to like actually make a long-term career plan and figure out your next step. And then we also have a separate process, which is called the decision-making process, which is when you have like a couple of career options, A, B, and C, and you want to choose between them specifically. Yeah, in our advice in general, it's really easy to focus on the kind of concrete career paths that we talk about because they're really salient. But with any career decision, it's going to be a really individual thing where you're going to have to factor in a lot of personal circumstances, your own strengths, all those kinds of things. So it's always, unfortunately, we can't just kind of come up with a list of the top 10 careers that everyone should do. You always have to think through your own decision. And so we try and help with that by providing these processes as well. I'm not going to go over them now because it's better just to read through them when you're facing a specific decision, but just going to could highlight a couple of points to particularly emphasize. So I think one big thing is it's easy to focus a bit too much on analysis rather than concretely gaining information. So we sometimes come across people who've kind of like been racking their brains, like analyzing these options, whereas they could have just gone and found out something that would have like immediately made the decision more obvious. So like one example recently was we came across an academic who was considering whether to do a sabbatical for a year in another location. And they thought about it a bunch, but they hadn't considered just going to visit that place for a week, which would have like probably made it a lot more clear whether they would actually want to spend a whole year there. We also sometimes see the opposite mistake where someone has just like quit their job and then they're going to like think full time about their career. And that often seems a bit risky unless you've got like a very clear plan worked out for like what you're going to do with this time and how you're going to make sure you have answers at the end. In general, we'd encourage people to kind of do a series of cheap tests or cheap ways to gain information, which go in ascending order of cost. So often initially, the most useful thing is just to go and talk to people about the job. And that's the most useful information to gain. And then later you can go on to more involved things like spending a week, the spending a week in the location, the sabbatical example, or like doing some kind of trial work, applying to the job. These are kind of bigger tests. And then you might even want to like kind of try the job for a year or something as a kind of much bigger commitment. The key thing is to be thinking about what are actually the key uncertainties that are driving actually would help me decide between option A and B, and how might I figure those out, and how might I get information that just answers those uncertainties. Yeah, the other most common mistake is probably just not considering enough options, which like all the kind of decision-making literature, that's maybe the kind of biggest single piece of advice or like biggest issue that's uncovered in that literature is like when people are faced with a decision, they can often improve the decision by just considering like a wider range of options than they're initially considering. And yeah, we come across people who've been following our advice for a while and just haven't considered options that seem obvious for them. So one example we mentioned in our annual review was Cullen, who was a lawyer at Harvard. And someone with that background, that's a great preparation to work on AI policy, but they just hadn't really considered that. They were thinking about earning to give or maybe environmental law, a bunch of other areas. And just they ended up actually making a bunch of applications in that area along with their other jobs. And they got a job offer from FHI, which is now where they're a researcher. Just the final thing on decision-making, career decisions are like a really messy domain where our intuitions are not necessarily a good guide. And so if you want to get better at making career decisions, a lot of that involves making these really difficult predictions about the future, like how successful might you be in different fields, like how high impact might this charity be. And all the best advice we found on like how to get better at that skill of making better predictions is Philip Tatlock's work. And so we've got 2 other podcasts with him, which provide a great introduction to all that kind of stuff.
Another comment on decision making is that every so often I encounter people who are like stressing a lot about their next career decision and kind of want to like work on it right away and make like lots of decisions, especially like decisions that they think will have like ramifications over many decades. it seems like going through like all of this process, learning all of this information, and then like figuring out like how to get yourself on a different career track is going to take probably at least like months, possibly years. And so people like shouldn't feel like an enormous pressure to like reassess all of these things right away. It's a marathon, not a sprint in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, yeah, just in general, these kinds of decisions can be very overwhelming, but it's always really useful just to then try to bring it down to like what specific options on the table, what are actually my key uncertainties, how might I figure those out? And yeah, that's what we hope the decision-making process helps with. It's just kind of like a checklist or like a bunch of prompts and questions that can help you at least make sure you haven't missed anything obvious and kind of do the best job you can of making the best decision you can, which is all you can do.
Hannah Ritchie on being selective when following others' advice.
Yeah, what's one of the most valuable mistakes you've ever made, and how can our listeners learn from it?
In terms of advice, I think like a lot of people would have advised me against a lot of the like trajectories I've went on, where I'm sure they would have said, I think that's a mistake. And I think again, this comes like back a little bit to like being this like generalist. And I've been told many times, like, if you want to progress in academia, you have to write papers. And kind of my point is that I don't really want to progress in academia. So I think one of the lessons I've learned is to like be quite selective about who I take advice from. I think if you're going to go down like a traditional pathway, there's loads of great advice out there and people can give you amazing advice, especially if they've like climbed the ranks in that field. I think if you're kind of like straddling many different ones, you need to be a bit more careful because it's such a like non-trodden path. People often can't see outside their like the traditional pathway that they followed. So I think it like for me, because I have like become more of a generalist, I think it's actually served me well to ignore some of the pieces of advice I've had in the past.
Right. Yeah, I would guess it's true of at least some of our listeners who are trying to have impacts with their career. Often the problems they're trying to address are neglected, and the solutions they're interested in are, are also neglected, and probably it involves, for some of them, some amount of like non-traditional path taking. That definitely feels true of me. And it sounds like, it's really probably easy to get advice from people who've gone the traditional path and then be like, oh no, am I doing the wrong thing? Like I'm supposed to stay in academia. And it sounds like you're saying for you, it's been really important to, I guess, would you say it was like taking advice from people who share more of your values or who understand your goals better?
Yeah, I think that, there's a fine line. My advice is not to like ignore all advice. And
sure.
I think there you can like very easily fall into a trap where like no one understands what I'm trying to do. So like I need to pave my completely like new path on my own. I don't think that's the case. There are people that can give you really good advice, but I think you need to just be like a bit more selective, and you need to find people that can maybe like think slightly beyond the conventional, and also like have people that you really trust that really want to give you advice in your best interests, not about like, I don't know, trying to like serve an academic institution, for example.
That makes a lot of sense.
Alex Lawsen on getting good mentorship.
Another common mistake you've seen people make is not following conventional wisdom on careers as much as they should. I'm sure there are lots of examples of this, but is there one that comes to mind?
Yeah, so I think, maybe the most important example is underemphasizing the value of getting good mentorship. And I think partly this is a conventional piece of wisdom about careers. In particular, there's like another level of the conventional wisdom aspect here where like I think lots of good mentorship is available outside of the like specific focus that you might have for your career. This might be like if you're interested in being a researcher, doing a project with someone who is an academic, but like not an academic who's interested in exactly the technical fields you want. And this is just, there isn't a ton of mentorship in the very narrow fields that most people who are focusing really hard on impact are pointing at, partly because they've picked those for neglectedness, among other things. yeah, so I guess that's one. It's just like you should be thinking about how fast you're able to learn and improve, especially early on. And I claim, as a former teacher, to be fair, so there's some bias here, that like who is helping you learn, who can you point to as a good example is like a really big aspect of how good a job is for you.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. Have you had the experience of getting good mentorship, and how valuable was that for you?
Yeah, I think I've experienced a variety of qualities of mentorship, and maybe this is why this is extremely salient. But like, I think some of the experiences I've had here being managed by Michelle, especially actually as I've transitioned into management myself, have just, I think, allowed me to develop far faster than I would have done absent that. Like, it's just really useful to be able to make mistakes and feel like psychologically safe enough to say, hey, I think I messed up this thing. Can we like talk about like what I maybe should have done instead? And yeah, maybe that's like a specific example of the kind of mentorship that can be really valuable, is someone who like you trust enough and feel safe enough with to like ask them about like specific things you messed up and get feedback on how to fix them, rather than just try a different thing next time. And then, you know, a large part of that is like you also want to rate them enough that you're going to listen when they say you should have done this.
Right. Yeah. Why do you think so many people are failing to get this, given how valuable it is?
I think part of it is that, I mean, like your ideal mentor, right, is someone who has the same values as you, who knows you really well, and who is like spending a ton of time helping you improve at this thing, while also the thing you're doing is something you're already good at and is like really good for the world. And like, that's just a lot of things. And there's not that many people like that for most people. And then in particular, if you're in a small community of like often pretty young people, it's going to be unusually hard to find a mentor who is also part of that community. So some of this is just like, there are not that many great mentors to go around. If you find one that ticks all of the boxes, you're really lucky, and you should like really, really be excited about that. But if you don't find one who ticks the specific box of like being a great mentor for you, then I think, yeah, maybe I just want to say like upweight that consideration compared to several others, like even how much impact am I having right now this second? I think, especially if you are planning to, you know, be trying to do good for quite a while, I would encourage more people than are currently, in my opinion, doing it to sacrifice some like immediate impact over the next like few months or years for a like really good learning opportunity where they can put themselves in a great position to do good work later.
Yeah. Okay. So practically speaking, that might mean something like if two roles seem pretty great, you're choosing between them, one of them seems a bit better on impact, the other one has exceptionally good mentorship. It's not crazy to choose the one that's plausibly worse on impact in order to get the huge boost from the mentorship.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. And maybe another example of this would be something like, let's stick with like an academic one. So like, yeah, you're trying to find a like supervisor for a research project, maybe for a graduate degree. And there's someone who is like known for just producing phenomenal students year after year. And this could be that their students get into the top conferences. It could be that their students just like go on to have really successful careers in other fields. It could just be that you've spoken to some of their current students and they've just said, she's always there for me, and like is really, really supportive with all of the stuff that I have struggled with, and like knows so much about this field. And then there's also someone who like, maybe even it's not that you know that they're bad on any of these axes, but you just like don't know them that well, but like they have an interest in clean air, and that is, you know, clean air specifically for like pandemic prevention, and that is the thing you're really interested in. And I'm just like, yeah, I mean, ideally find out more information about both. Like grad school is a big decision. Asking to speak to some current students of both seems like a good idea, but like it seems possible that if you're going to be doing, you know, some relevant research in both, taking the mentor who is like a bit less aligned with your ultimate values, but way better for you at like actually helping you learn a bunch of useful skills and research, I imagine that's the best trade more often than I perceive people to be taking it.
Cool. Yeah. Are there other examples of kind of conventional career wisdom that people are ignoring or just not putting enough weight on?
Yeah. So I think another one is like just doing a normal job at a like company or organization that's known for like being run well. And I think this is just like, there are trade-offs. If you join some small scrabby startup with only 3 people, then like seems totally possible that you get to gain a bunch of responsibility really quickly. And like, that might be the best choice for some people. But like, sometimes just, really established programs that like know how to grab like smart graduates without much work experience and like turn them into extremely valuable employees really quickly just are actually good at that. Like, I don't know, trying really hard to do a thing for many years probably makes you at least decent at that thing. Maybe if I can think of some specific examples from different fields here, like I notice that many of the people I am like just incredibly impressed with on the like on their ability to think about different like quantitative technical problems have at some point worked at Jane Street.
Interesting. Okay.
And like, to be clear, I think some of this is probably that whoever Jane Street's recruiters are, they're doing a really good job of just like selecting people who are super bright and talented. But my guess is that some of it is like, there's a bunch of competent people that work there. They know how to take a certain kind of like bright, talented person and like help them learn how to think about particular things in a particular way. And like, at least if that is the case, then like that should upweight your potential like decision to go in that direction.
Chris Olah on cold emailing that actually works.
I've seen in your articles that you're also just generally a big proponent of writing cold emails to people. You found that that's worked pretty well for you. Do you think that generalizes to others as well?
I get a lot of cold emails. 99% of them are terrible. They are, can you do my homework for me? Or like, can you answer this basic question that I could Google for like 1 minute and answer? And so I think people get this impression that cold emailing doesn't work because, of course, if you send emails like that, people are overwhelmed and aren't going to respond. Or even if you just like very generically are like, you send a nicely written email and you're like, I'm trying to get into machine learning. Can you do a half an hour phone call with me to talk about how to do that? Even that, you're not very likely to get a response from. But I think the thing that people miss is that if you write really good cold emails, it's actually not that hard to be the best email I received that week. And I think that if you're willing to invest energy in understanding, what a researcher or a group is working on, and you're specifically referring to their papers, and you have thoughtful questions at things. Yeah, I think that people pay a lot of attention to that. And I think that it very often works well. And so I think there's a big gap in what people mean when they talk about cold emails. And I think that if you're willing to put in the work, and I mean, if you just genuinely really care about what somebody's doing and have put in the work to understand it and can talk about it really intelligently, that's going to come through and is, it's a much more compelling reason for the person to talk to you than other things.
Right. So it sounds like you don't think that people should write tons of cold emails to all kinds of people. But if there is someone whose work you're really into, whose work you really understand, then you should not be sheepish about emailing them. Because even if they're getting other emails, your one is really going to potentially stand out if you can demonstrate that you have actually read their paper.
Well, and I think the other thing is, I think there's a lot of people who are trying to look at how to get into machine learning. And what they do is they send lots of emails to people or they like email famous people. I think what you should actually be doing is trying to figure out who you would be really excited to work with and really understand their work. And ideally, do somebody who's a little bit less famous, maybe, and then reach out to that person with an email where you've put a lot of work into sort of explaining it, being clear that you've read their work and like connecting your interests to theirs and things like this. And so there's a number of emails that have been really important for me where I spent like a week writing them. And I think that was a totally worthwhile investment. And I think that's not how people usually think about cold emails.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. How do you feel about length? Maybe we're going to get a little bit into the weeds of email technique here, but go on.
I think a lot of the most impactful emails I've written were only a few paragraphs long, less than 1 page. But I read like 5 of that person's papers beforehand. And, I think that comes through in subtle ways. And I didn't integrate it super ham-fistedly, but I just, I was writing to them because I genuinely was invested and cared about their work and had shared interests with them. And yeah, I think that's very, very different.
Yeah. I think the main lesson that I've learned, well, I suppose this is a different class of cold email. This is kind of asking people for small favors or for feedback or offering advice. It's that the shorter it is, the more likely people are to engage. Well, certainly the shorter it is, the more likely people are to answer. And maybe also if you can really condense down the information that you want to convey into like just a couple of sentences, that people are much more likely to absorb it. Because people are flicking through their email inbox pretty quickly, and often they have like other things going on. And if they open an email and it's a wall of text, then that you definitely run the risk that they're just going to close it and then never get back to it because it's just too much. And they don't yet know whether it's really worth investing the time in.
Yeah, I think you really want to, if you're writing something longer as well, you want to really optimize the introduction for that reason.
Pardis Sabeti on prioritizing physical health to do your best work.
On this topic of overcoming big challenges in life and in your career, you suffered this really horrific car accident in 2015, which almost killed you and took days of surgery and I guess years of physical therapy to recover from. And I guess it's the kind of thing you never fully recover from. I guess most people suffer some kind of horrible setback in their life or career at some point, which takes them out of work for months or maybe years, whether it's physical illness, mental illness, bereavement, an important project falling apart and breaking their heart. And those tragedies can be really hard to bounce back from. Did you kind of learn anything about how to recover from physical illnesses and kind of personal tragedy from that accident and like find a way to get back on your feet?
Yeah. So just to kind of set the stage, it was actually July 2015, just as things were starting to calm down a little bit, after Ebola. And I was at a conference of all places. And basically I was in an accident where I was catapulted onto boulders, shattered my pelvis and both my knees. Required, I think, it was a week of surgeries, like 3 or 4. I don't know why suddenly I'm like 3 or 4 surgeries, but all day. I think 4 all-day surgeries, about 30 hours of surgery, and I now have 6 plates and 30 giant rods that stitch together my pelvis and my knees. So it's a lot. It was definitely a lot, and it was sort of and definitely knocked me into the present, into literally the room I was in and nothing else, and was basically hospital bound, bed bound for 4 months. And yeah, it's a daily recovery process. It's a lifetime recovery process. And I think the things that I learned about from that was that, we kind of, in the world today, we often, everything seems to be in the mind, everything is in like what's happening here. And ultimately our mind does not work if our body doesn't work. It just doesn't like that. So the thing is, we cannot forget our bodies at all times. It is the engine that runs everything else. And so it forced me to take a moment and say, I need to make this body work. And I had to, for somebody who like never even takes a day off without doing some work, I like to kind of not be able, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do anything but that. So I just turned all my attention to making my physical therapy, becoming a scientist of injury and trying to figure out how to make my body work. And since then, like I dedicate a lot of every day I have to dedicate time to working my body and working all of these, scar tissue and bones that are with me as best as I can. And so I think that ultimately it's probably the thing that I like learned the most about it is just that if my body is not well, then I can't do my best work. And that ultimately you have to support yourself in everything you do. And so I think that also when I run my lab, it's in that same way. I'm constantly trying to, I know I run the team. There's no way we run hard. It's not that we don't run hard. And it's not that, I pulled more all-nighters than I want to admit this year, but I still always try to kind of hold the fort and say but I have to take care of me. And so it's just really important. And also knowing that I think the other thing is also how much you can do with exercise and paying attention to it, right? That the fact of the matter is most of these things can be solved. While I love Western medicine, we are way too reliant on it and complicit on it. And I think some of the best support I've gotten is from outside modalities that are really remarkable. And I don't think we use it enough of using kind of other ways of improving our health and our well-being. And I, for example, never used any, other than obviously during the surgeries and a few weeks after, I stopped using pain medication, even though that sounds crazy, but I found massage did what it needed to do. Massage is amazing. It's underutilized. And then after massage, a stretching modality that I use called resistance stretching. Those things were really amazing and are outside of what we kind of call medicine, but I think was far more potent and powerful. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. So
yeah, I guess it makes complete sense that it's very hard for the brain to work really well if the rest of the body that it's attached to isn't being kept in good shape. I guess I feel like most of my friends I think take that view and think that it's good holistically to exercise and to stay in shape and take care of your physical health. Have you found that people don't think that?
I think people do, in that conceptually, but do they really do that? And particularly, I would say for me, I haven't gone to medical school. Medical school is designed to make you anxious, depressed, and unhealthy. And I always find that really remarkable that basically we would never go to a barber with bad hair or a facialist with bad skin, but our doctors often have such poor health. And so I think, for example, like it's pretty remarkable how little personal health is valued in the medical training and profession. And so that's for me an example I do think that there's a lot of industries in which personal health is not valued. And I think, and sad to me that I think, the medical profession has some of the highest rates of suicide and depression of any. And those are the people that are the keepers of our health. So that's a real issue for me. It kind of speaks to what is the integrity of the process you're doing, but it's not their fault. Having gone to medical school, you're just beaten into that, where it's all about all-nighters and all of that. So I do think that while conceptually, yes, people get that matters, I think in practice, no, too often not. And I didn't. I was running myself into the ground.
Yeah, I mean, the stories I've heard about kind of just the indignity and the cruelty that people go through during medical training I found kind of mind-boggling. And I mean, obviously it's terrible for them, and it's very dangerous for patients as well, because it means that people can't do proper work because they're being run into the ground. It's like you don't want your surgeon to be run into the ground.
Chris Olah on developing good taste and technique as a researcher.
So I know you've written this article about how people can develop good taste in what to research and how to go about it. Yeah, maybe could you give people a summary of your views there?
Sure. So first of all, I don't consider myself at all an expert on this. And this is just sort of my essence for what's worked with me and when I've been mentoring people, things that I've found helpful. But I think it's often helpful to divide being a good researcher into two parts. One is taste, so your ability to go and pick good problems and go and pick good avenues to attack those problems and things like this. And the second you might call technique or execution. And, I think, maybe if you picture a chemist working with vials and pipettes and weird things, it's sort of pretty clear that there's a whole technique to going and manipulating that laboratory equipment. And I think that it's subtler in other fields, but I think that there is something certainly in machine learning of the technique of training models and even just of being a good programmer and doing very minute things of manipulating your code editor or going and manipulating distributed systems and stuff like this. And so I think that's sort of a question of how do you develop both of those skills? And for taste, I think that's probably the hardest one to develop. I tried to come up with a sort of list of exercises that one could do. And an example, and I think probably the most useful one, is just write down a list of problems that you think might be important to work on. And then have somebody else, ideally your mentor, go and just rate them 1 to 10. Because one of the really hard things about developing taste is that you have such a slow feedback loop on learning lessons, because you have to go and do the entire project normally. And so what you want to do is use a mentor or use somebody else as sort of a cheap proxy for getting feedback. And then if you disagree with their feedback, you can either talk to them about it, or maybe you even want to go and do that experiment. So I think that could be useful. And I think there's lots of other things. I think reading about the history of science is helpful. I think going and trying to write just about why you think things are important is helpful. So in any case, I think there's a bunch of exercises there. And then on the technique side, I actually think the most valuable thing here is working closely with people who have good technique. And I think actually, at least in machine learning and probably other computer science disciplines, going and pair programming with people is immensely valuable. I think that there's a lot of stuff that's hard to communicate in other forms that gets passed along when people are pair programming. And so I think for developing technique, often pair programming is the highest leverage thing to do.
It's really interesting. I'd noticed, so I guess in fields of work, it kind of tasks where they have a physical embodiment, we're actually moving things around in the physical world. People get to see one another and they get to learn from watching them what they're doing and figure out how to do it better. And for work on computers and laptops, that exists much less.
Exactly.
Because there just seems to be a culture in general that someone... You don't, when you arrive at an organization, you're trying to get training, for example, from your manager, you don't literally sit behind them all day and watch what they do. That would be maybe that would be sensible, but you can't just sit behind them and watch their screen and then see how do they move the windows? How do they reply to people? That doesn't happen. And I guess that means that it's possible for people to just miss really basic stuff potentially. And it just sounds like maybe in programming, there is this peer programming thing in part to fill this gap because it's maybe such a severe problem there.
Yeah. I think there's an increasing culture at a lot of organizations of pair programming. I feel like I hear people talking about it a lot more. And I've found that it's really helpful for passing this sort of stuff along. And I myself am constantly learning from other people when I work with them. And I hope that they're learning from me as well. I think your point about how it's hidden by, when it's not physical, sort of technique gets hidden by that is a really good one.
Yeah. I think that culture exists in part because people are worried about, well, I guess two reasons. One is sheepishness, perhaps, about like people disagreeing with how they're going about their work. It's like easy to just hide it and like never have people watch your screen. Another might be that you're worried about confidentiality. You don't want other people like looking over your shoulders and reading your emails. There's a real norm of not looking at other people's screens in general. But it seems like maybe we should think about ways to work around that. Like you'd have a specified time when someone literally is just going to watch you work, and then you try to not do anything that would be too sensitive, where they shouldn't be looking at the screen. I think I'd be fascinated to see how my colleagues just go about their day. Like how often do they switch windows as often as I do? I don't know. It's so key sometimes, some of these basic skills to your productivity that it could be worthwhile.
Well, I think it's also not just teaching. Like I think often you can just push through things faster if you have a second person with you. I guess Jeff and Sanjay are famous for, being extremely impactful at Google and pair programming all the time.
So they sit together with their computers next to one another and they just work together on a problem.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, do you have a theory for why that's not more common? It seems like it might be just a really sensible way to get things done.
I think it is modestly common in programming and software engineering. And I guess the thing that I'm trying to highlight here is that it's a really useful, like I think people sometimes feel just like, it's a nice way to work, I think, or it's like an effective way to work. But I think, especially if you're trying to develop technique, I think it's the best way to go and transmit it that I'm aware of.
Benjamin Todd on why it's so important to apply to loads of jobs.
Just one point I wanted to highlight now is the importance of making a lot of applications. So one of our team members, Howie Lempel, when he was trying to get a job at a think tank, he applied to about 30 places, including some economic research institutes, lots of think tanks. And he got turned down by almost all of them, though he got a job offer from Brookings, which is pretty much one of the most prestigious think tanks. And that just shows that even someone who's like qualified to get into some of the top jobs in a sector still needs to apply really widely and might get rejected a lot of times.
Yeah, I don't envy people who are applying for jobs. It's like something that kind of everyone has to go through, like potentially many times in their lives. But it's like it's a very stressful thing to do. And like even if you've like been at the top of your game, you potentially have to just apply for like so many jobs and like accept the fact that you're just going to be rejected potentially again and again and again. It could be like quite demoralizing.
Yeah, and sometimes, especially early in our career, we might not have gone through a process of getting rejected 30 times in a row. It's a pretty difficult experience to go through. Yeah, a typical job application process might only have like a couple of % acceptance rate. So you can kind of see from that as a ballpark, you're going to be thinking that you need to apply to say like 20 to maybe more than 50 places to be confident of having a job.
One thing to keep in mind is just how random the job application process is, that like very often organizations, especially in these kind of like very skilled jobs, are like looking for someone with like very specific capabilities and like the ability to like get along with a very particular manager or a very particular team, where like someone could be qualified in lots of ways, but then if they're kind of like randomly missing like one kind of idiosyncratic factor, then potentially that they can just not be suitable for it. And it's not like a condemnation of them as a person by any means.
Exactly. There's kind of your general purpose skills, and then you need the specific skills needed in that job. But then you also need like some very narrow, like you need the fit with the team and fit with that specific manager. And yeah, so someone who's really talented in many ways could easily get turned down from many jobs.
I mean, another thing to keep in mind, perhaps that's might provide some comfort if someone's like applying to lots of jobs and not getting in, is that if you're not getting rejected to like most of the jobs you're applying for, then you're almost certainly not being ambitious enough about the places that you're trying to get into, given like how many hours you spend working at a job that you get versus like how many hours it takes to apply for a job. Maybe it's like good to have only a few % acceptance rate, because you should be like, aiming really, you should be aiming like sufficiently high, or trying to be sufficiently ambitious that like you should be getting turned down most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a difficult question because we definitely come across people who are both, some people are overconfident and some people are underconfident. And so we've found people who ended up working at like great organizations in the community, but like beforehand they had to be encouraged to apply. They like didn't think they would get the job, and then they ended up doing really well at it, kind of like to their surprise. And people like that need to be encouraged to apply more widely. Though like we've also found people who say like, recently someone was like saying like, my backup job is to work at an effective altruism organization, but like many of those positions are actually really competitive, and that's like not going to serve as a good backup. But I agree with what you're saying that in general, I think the error is to like not apply enough, because as you say, there's this kind of asymmetry where spending several months making applications is unpleasant, but like if you can get that even better role, that's like many years of having that better role. in general, like the potential upsides are like greater than the downsides.
Yeah, the main reason people don't do that, I think, is that, as you're saying, it's unpleasant to apply for jobs, which I suppose is a reason not to do it. And as much as you find it unpleasant, it's like that's a reason to try to cut short the process a bit. But if you can like find a way to just kind of grit through and like, apply for even more places and try to get something that's even better, and that doesn't bother you too much, then maybe it's like worth having a crack.
Yeah, I mean, in general, also try to have some stretch options where you think you're like maybe like don't have a good chance of getting them, but you're like trying to like maybe push yourself a bit in case you're being underconfident, but also try to have a bunch of backup options to like ensure that you have something solid at the end of the process. One other thing is like, there is a lot you can do to increase your odds of getting a specific job. And we cover a bunch of advice on that in the article itself. But then like, even accounting for that, even if you can bring up your odds, like it would be pretty hard to bring them up to like more than 10% per job. And so you'd still need to apply to quite a large number of places.
Varsha Venugopal on embracing uncomfortable situations and celebrating failures.
Do you have any general life advice that you think is underrated?
I think one experiment I have done over the last few years, which has served me well, is around putting myself in uncomfortable situations. It's almost like building a muscle. I think there's a whole classic book on this, which is called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And especially, I think, as an entrepreneur, you get thrown in uncomfortable situations quite a lot. And I think consciously and deliberately choosing to do that in your daily life, whatever that is, I know buying something expensive you otherwise absolutely wouldn't, or talking loudly somewhere where you wouldn't. It just, I think, in a way, helps you increase your comfort zone and helps you face some of those uncomfortable situations better.
Yeah, I guess, well, talking more loudly in a public space isn't super important in itself, but I guess the idea is you're training this general ability when it does actually matter at some point to be able to, violate convention or do something that you haven't done before.
Yeah. Another one my colleagues talk about is the idea of collecting failures, which I again think is super useful for entrepreneurs to think about. I know in fundraising, it's almost a stat, right? You have 90% negative responses for every 10% positive. So it's almost, again, deliberately aiming to go get those negatives so you can increase the odds for some of the positives.
Yeah. Collect them in what way? Oh, I see. Oh, the idea is you should consider it a success every time you're rejected for a job or a grant or something, because that makes it more motivating to do it.
Or consider it a failure, but celebrate it anyway. So go out there and collect some of them. Maybe it doesn't have to be, huge failures, but just on a daily basis. You may be afraid to go talk to someone, but just do it because it's another failure in your pot.
Yeah, that's super interesting. There's some people on Twitter who I think they publish like every time they get rejected for a paper from a journal, or every time they get turned down for a job and things like that. It's unpleasant to be rejected for a paper or for a job or a grant or whatever else. But then if you can make content out of it where you get to share your misery with the public and people get to talk about how, well, of course, everyone has been turned down for so many things before. It somehow makes it, I think, perhaps more enjoyable or motivating for folks because they get to share their frustration.
Yeah, I think at some point it almost became a meme, right? There was some Princeton professor who posted something on all his failures. And I think, it took it to a different level. But I think fundamentally there is something there we could all aspire to do more of, fail.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's the challenge with all sorts of discussion about how to be more successful or all lifestyle advice is that you only get this top 10% of like things that people think that they work, things that they're willing to share, which is not most of our lives. We like prefer to keep it private rather than sharing it on social media or putting it in a podcast, which can very much bias kind of what kinds of things you hear.
True.
Yeah, I think that. So obviously most people's CVs are like all of the papers they did publish, all of the jobs they did get, and they went through and put into their CV every single time that they were rejected for anything, which made it incredibly long, but entertaining and I think relatable.
Hey listeners, I hope you enjoyed revisiting some of those moments. As I said in the intro, we have loads more resources on the 80,000 Hours website to help you with finding a career that does good in the world, including a step-by-step career planning guide, weekly research newsletter, and one-on-one career advising. The best part is that we're a nonprofit, so everything we provide is free. Check that out at 80,000hours.org. All right, thanks to the production team for putting together that compilation. We'll be back with a fully new interview very soon.